this is Michael McCarthy. In this DVD, we'll be covering many of the new features in 3ds Max 2011, using them in a production environment. We'll take this GameRes character and rig it for animation using CAT. We will create a rig from scratch, incorporating things like horns and facial components. We'll then add some muscles for the legs and the back of the character that will incorporate secondary action. We'll be applying skin to the character and transitioning from a skin pose into a character walk cycle. Next, we'll look at setting up this character's materials using the Slate node-based Material Editor. We'll then set up advanced viewport rendering and use that rendering to output with the Quicksilver renderer. Using a high poly head sculpt, we'll create surface maps using Slate to layer them together to achieve a detailed and fast render without lights or advanced rendering parameters. Finally, we'll take a look at using the new Viewport Canvas tools to paint directly in the viewport of 3ds Max using a Wacom tablet and custom brushes. We'll make use of layers to blend, mask, and adjust color like we would working in Photoshop. We'll then create views, bump, and other maps, painting right in the viewport, and improve on detailed maps that have already been painted traditionally. At the end of this DVD, you should have a good understanding of many of the new features in 2011 and how to use them in a production environment. So let's get started. In this section, we're going to take a look at CAT. CAT is a character animation toolkit that ships with 3ds Max 2011. Previous to 2011, you could get CAT if you want subscription in 2010 or even as a plugin before that. CAT is a tool set that will allow you to create rigs for any type of character, including bipeds, quadrupeds, and even multi-legged characters like you can see here with this spider. It also allows you the ability to take your characters and add a bunch of different layers to them so that you can have procedural animation. And it has a system called Cat Motion, which will allow you to adjust different parameters to have procedural motion on your characters based on curves and other things like that. And that's what these characters are walking with now. To create a character with CAT, we're just going to delete these guys here and go over to Create, Helpers, and choose CAT Objects. You can see there's a couple of different buttons here. And to create a character, we're going to click on Cat Parent. You can also see that Cat Muscles are available, which is a muscle system that you can use to deform objects and add different skinning abilities to your characters. If I just drag out a quick little cat muscle, you can see it gives us this little plane here. And if we go over into the front view, drag out a little muscle strand here, or maybe a bicep or a quad muscle. And we'll be taking a look at how to use those a little bit later. If you want to create a character, there's two different ways that you can do that. With CAT, you can create a preset character very much like you would with biped, that then you can adjust to the size and the shape of whatever character you happen to be rigging. Or you can create a custom rig where you create all the different limbs and bones yourself. So you can see down here when you click on Cat Parent, you can choose to load or save a rig. If I just have none chosen, CAT assumes that I'm going to build a custom rig myself where I'll create all sorts of different bones and position them exactly the way that I want for a character, and I'm not going to use a preset, which we'll be doing later. If you click on a different preset, then CAT is going to drag out that preset. So if we choose this alien, we'll get a preset alien rig. We can grab this ape here, or a lot of times if you're doing just a basic bipedal character, you'll either use the base human character, or there's even a biped character. If you're used to the look and shape of the biped, then you can use something that approximates the look and feel of the biped. So what we're going to do is we're going to set up our character just like this. We're going to use the base human setup, and we're going to drag that out. So if I click on Cat Parent, choose base human, and drag him out. To get any properties from any CAT object, you're either going to go to the Modify panel, where you'll see different things. So right here we have the base of the character selected, and you can adjust its height and some other things about the character. And if we select any portion of a bone, then you can tell which limb it happens to be, if it's a right or left limb, and you can adjust things like how many twist bones it has and other things like that. If you select any portion of the cat character and you go to the motion panel, similar to biped, this is where all of your different motion abilities will be. So if we can go into our layer manager and adjust our character. Now, when you're setting up a character like this, there's two different modes, similar to how you might set it up with biped. In biped, you have a figure mode and you have an animation mode. It's kind of the same thing, but in cat, you just start up in setup mode, and once you start animating, you're going to press this little animate button, and then you'll be animating the character. So right off the bat, you can grab any one of these limbs and start moving it into place. So they behave very much like stretchy bones, or like if you were in edit bone mode, and you can just kind of conform this character into the shape that you want. So we can move that over there. And you can also use things like scale. If we want to scale this guy, we can scale the bones, scale the hand out, or maybe the spine. So to do this, we're going to get a mesh that we might approximate our bones to. So let's open up a file real quickly. Let's go ahead and open the next file, which is E3D 2011 Cat02. In this scene, we have a real simple base mesh that we can take our character and make or conform the bones to. So we're just going to go and create helpers, choose cat helpers, and with our base human chosen, let's go into the center and click and drag out basically the same height as our mesh. When we're done with that, we can just right click and we'll go into the front view. I'm going to make this flat, and I'm going to select the mesh and hit Alt X, and then I'm going to freeze it so that it is not selectable in the viewport, and I'll just turn on edge faces, get rid of the grid, and now I can easily move my cat bones into position. I'll start off with the arm and just move the hand up and to the right, and I'm going to rotate the hand. You want to make sure that you're in local coordinate system so that these guys rotate in the direction that the bones are set up. And then we'll move that next bone. We'll grab this shoulder and move it down and into place. And if you want the clavicle to start a little bit over here, we can do that as well. Then we'll go into the top view, and I can see that I need to rotate the hand over this way, and we'll just start to move these more inside the arm there. If you need to scale these, you can, so I'm just going to scale this guy up. And we're not going to worry about the fingers for right now. I'll go back into the front view, and it looks like I could adjust, moving that back a little bit and moving this hand joint back a little bit. So when I'm happy with the setup of this, I can select the root of this particular limb, and Kata is set up in a bunch of different hubs and limbs. So something like the chest would be a hub and the arm is a limb. Something like the pelvis is a hub and the leg is a limb. So if you select the root of the limb and you go to the Modify panel, you can see that we have copy and paste options. I'm just going to copy this, and then I'm going to select the other side, and I'm going to say paste mirror. And you can see it moves the position, the rotation, the scale of that arm over to the other side. Now that we're happy with the arms, we'll move on to the leg. I'm just going to select the root of this leg here and move that over. And the legs have a IK target at the bottom, so we're going to move that over to the right here for this leg and just rotate it slightly so that it aligns up with the foot a little bit better. And the knee looks like it aligns properly here. I might scale this out so it's a little bit thicker and go into the right view. So we'll just cruise over here And I'm going to position this foot a little bit back, and I'll position this leg a little bit down and back, I think. And this one here, so that catches the knee. And I'm pretty happy with that. So we'll go into the front view, select the root of this limb, click on copy, and then select the opposite leg and say paste mirror. Now we have the general setup for our arms and our legs. I'll go in and select these spine links and scale those up so that they're a little bit fatter. And I could scale the chest if I wanted to too. Move the arms out a little bit and go into the left view. And you can see that the pelvis we might want to move forward a little bit. And definitely the spine, so we'll go to the root of the spine and move that forward and select these again and scale them slightly so they fit the volume of the mesh. I'm going to move the chest hub back, and let's look in the top view just to make sure that these arms are lining up where we want, and they are. And we're going to select the root of the neck and move that forward slightly, and maybe just scale these a little bit. So we can go and look around in the perspective view here, but for the most part we have this guy kind of fitting to the mesh that we have, which is really good. Now we're ready to skin. This is a real basic example, and we'll do a quick skin on it, but we'll be moving forward and doing something a little bit more complex with a game character later. I just wanted to make sure that with a basic character and simple mesh, we understood the workflow of taking your bones and fitting them to that mesh. To skin this character, we're going to unfreeze the character, and I'll press Alt-X to just bring it back from being transparent, and we'll add the skin modifier, and then click on Add Bones. From here we want to make sure that we add all the bones. Now, cat object has a bunch of different bones, and it has a bunch of helpers too. Make sure that you don't have helpers selected, because we don't want to select the base object, which is the object that controls the entire character, or we don't want to select the IK platforms of the character to skin those. We really just want the bones. So we're going to select those, and now the character will be skinned. And let's go into animation mode for the character. I think I'll take this guy and just click on Alt-X again and freeze it. And then with the cat object selected, we'll go to the motion panel, and in order to animate the character, we want to get into animation mode. To get into animation mode, you need to add some sort of layer to the layer manager, and then you can press this little stop and play button in order to get into animation mode. If you click on this button right here, these are the different types of layers that we have. We'll get into how to use all of these, but for now, let's just click an absolute layer. So we'll select an absolute layer, and you can see it's an absolute animation layer. And now we'll be able to press this play button, which means anything that we do to the rig is going to behave in IK, FK mode, and the bones won't stretch out, and we'll be able to animate the character. So we'll just go to, I don't know, frame 5 here, and move the character's arm down on both sides, and maybe grab this little helper for the leg and bend that up like so. And you can kind of put your character into a fairly generic skin pose. We'll rotate this like so. So now we're able to get out of auto key mode, and you can see the character bends and deforms. So I'll unfreeze the character, press Alt-X, and now this is a good way to go in and adjust all of your envelopes of the character, because you have the skin pose, and we can just kind of scrub back and forth between and see how the envelopes are affecting different pieces of the character. In this section, we're going to take a look at rigging this game character with a custom cat rig. This guy is a little more unusual than maybe a standard biped, so instead of taking a preset and forming it to this character, we're actually just going to build a custom rig ourselves, and that'll take us through the steps. Before we get started, there's a couple things I want to look at. You can see that we have the textures displayed in the viewport here, and if we go into the material editor, you'll see that I've set the material editor just the compact material editor. 3ds Max 2011 has both the compact and the Slate Material Editor. Seeing as we won't be doing a lot with materials in this scene and we'll be focusing on rigging, we'll just use the compact material editor. Later on we'll be looking a lot at the Slate Material Editor and all the different nodes that we can set up with it. In the material editor, you can see that we have show map and viewport for this material, and we also have that set to hardware shading. If you click on the flyout, you can see that we have both like standard map and with hardware shading, and you should be able to see a large difference between the two. Just the standard map display in the viewport is pretty blurry and not very detailed, and the hardware shading gives us all these nice details as well as our normal map and other things in there. So if I just turn off the diffuse map, you'll see that the normal map will come up, and we're getting some nice detail on the character here right in the viewport. You can also notice that when I did that, we got this checker pattern on the character. That means that 3ds Max is calculating the shader or compiling the shader behind the scenes as we do that. If that's the case, please remember that while this checker pattern is in the viewport, you can actually interact with your objects and 3ds Max. It doesn't mean that your 3ds Max scene is on hold. The next thing I want to look at in the scene is just the layers. We have a couple layers set up for the character, the bones, the lights in the scene, as well as some muscles that we'll be adding later. If we can, let's just hide the character, and let's select the default layer. I want to look at creating a base cat rig without our character quite yet, just so that we can know where all the pieces go. So we can close this layer manager, and we'll go over to Create Helpers, and choose Cat Parent. Now if you want to create a custom cat rig, you need to have this None preset chosen instead of one of the other ones when you drag out your parent. So click and drag that out, and you'll see that pretty much only this little base comes with it. Now with that base selected, if we go to the Modify panel, you'll see that there are a couple of different things that we can do with this character. Down at the very bottom, you can see that with the platform selected, you can choose Create Pelvis. And this is the first thing that you need to do to create a custom rig. So when we click on Create Pelvis, you'll see that it creates this node in the scene. We can select that pelvis, and you'll see you'll get different options in the Modify panel. There's a couple of different places you can access cat parameters and attributes. One is in the Modify panel, one is in the Motion panel, and some other behind the scenes are down in the Hierarchy panel. Cat is set up with a series of hubs, spines, and limbs that you create your custom character with. And the first hub is the pelvis that you set up, and we can position this wherever we want in the scene. And then from there, we're either going to add a spine to it or some sort of limb. So there's an option to add a leg, add a spine, add an arm, a tail, and a couple of other options there as well. So if I just click on Add a Leg, it'll quickly add a leg, and I can move this leg into place. So very much like we were doing with our other character, we can adjust all these parameters of the leg. And then if we want, we can go back to that pelvis and we can add in another leg. So we'll click on Add Leg, and it'll kind of mirror what was done on the other side. So this way you can create all sorts of different characters. In this case, maybe we'd want to take both of these legs and move them back, and then create another set of legs. So I'll choose Add Leg. We can put that one there in the back and move that over here and go back and add another leg, and it will mimic the one that we just edited. So we can do a lot of different things with this. Now that we have the general idea of how this works, let's just select all this and remove it, and let's bring back our character. I'll just bring up the layers. We want to be able to see our character, and if we're going to be setting up bones, we want to be on the bones layer. and we want to be able to see those bones, so we'll keep that up there. Now for this character, I'm just going to select him and press Alt-X so that we can see through the character. And a lot of times when I'm creating bones, I'll set it to a flat view mode, and maybe set it to edge faces so I can kind of see what's going on there. So now with our character ready, let's go and create our cat parent. So I'm going to create this here and just kind of drag it out in the middle here, kind of big enough to fit our character. And maybe we'll pop over to the left view and move that into place there, and then back to the front view so we can kind of see what's going on there. And that looks pretty good to me. We may want to just align this with the character, and for that you can use Quick Align. Might have to move it back down, but at least the center axes will be aligned there. So now we're ready to start adding different pieces to this rig. We'll go to Modify, scroll all the way to the bottom, and click on Create Pelvis. And that pelvis will be created in this view. So now you can position the pelvis inside the character the way that you want. Usually try and go and do this in orthographic views. Perspective view is good for viewing your character and moving things a lot of times, but sometimes it's best to set stuff up in orthographic views like the front. And I think that looks pretty good. We can scale this out a bit too. And once we're happy with that, we'll go over here to the Modify panel and click on Add a Leg, and we'll see our leg is added there. So now we can kind of position this here in the view. Let's move the platform over first and move it forward to kind of fit in with the leg. Now on this leg, we can have a lot of different things going on. If you select the root of the limb and you go over into the Modify panel, you'll see that we have the limb set up. We have the number of bones in the limb. We have an up vector node if we want to add that for the bend of the knee. And we have some segments to the leg as well. So for instance, this leg is just a 2-bone leg. We can make it like a chicken or horse limb and add 3. Or you can add many more than that if you're dealing with something that needs that many bones. We're going to stick with 2 for right now because even though this has kind of a hoof, it'll be good for what we're doing here. Now, because we're dealing with this IK chain at the bottom here, the foot, usually I like to set up the ankle or the foot first. So let's just freeze our character here. Click on Freeze Selected, and that'll allow us to see it a little better in the view too. And then we can select this foot. So once our platform is pretty much where we want it and aligned, let's just get that going. Select that IK platform and put it kind of in the middle of the hoof. We'll now want to rotate this ankle into place, so we can just rotate so that it's almost straight up, and we want to try and align it with where its joint is going to be, and then we're going to scale it up using local coordinates so that that fits like this, and we'll just rotate that into place so it fits in the center. Then we may need to rotate it in the front view as well so that it goes up into the center of the character's foot there. Now if we want to, we can go in and we can scale this on the other axes if we want it to be a little bit thicker so it fits inside the leg a little more. And then we can just go to our other bones and start moving them into place. So in the front view here, we'll just select this bone and move the knee in there, and then we'll go to the left view. And we can see that we need to move this back slightly. And now that's fitting pretty well inside of the leg. I think this one is a little bit thick, so we'll just scale it down on its local Z and Y axes. And then maybe the thigh could be a little bit bigger. We're actually going to add some muscles later, so I would prefer to keep the thigh a little bit thin at this point, and that's what we're going to do. Now that we have this leg pretty much where we want it, all we're going to do is create it on the other side. So let's select the pelvis and choose Add Leg. And because all the additions that we've added here, it just copies them over to the other side so that we have them exactly on the other side too. The next thing we can do is add a spine to our character. So I'm just going to go into the left view, and with the pelvis selected, I'm going to choose Add Spine. See, it will add a spine up the center of the character that we can then move into place. So I'm going to select the top of the spine here and just kind of move it towards where the shoulders or chest of this character would be. And if I want, I can rotate this as well so that it's kind of facing in the right direction for that. So maybe something like that. Then I can go in and I can adjust each one of these spine links individually so that they fit in the center of the character. These can be a little bit thicker, so we can scale them up on the local axes here. I'm also just going to pop into the front view here, and we can see these guys are a little bit too thin, so we can select them there and just scale them out a little bit so they fit the mesh a little bit better there as well. And when you're pretty happy with what you got, we can just move along to the next pieces. I'll scale up this as well, a little bit thicker for the chest joint. Now, what you'll see is when we select the root, which is this piece up here, we have all the same things that we did for the pelvis. If we select the first spine in the chain here, you can see that it will give us all of our spine parameters over here. So, things like the length, width, and height, as well as the number of bones. So, we have 5 in this spine, and I think that's fine, but we can adjust it, down to 3 or something else like that if we wanted to. So now we have the spine set up in the character, and we're going to move on to adding some arms. So let's just select this and click on Add Arm. And you can see we get a little arm that pops out, and we can move this into place. When you are positioning these arms, it's a good idea to kind of keep track of the orientation so that you don't get something that's kind of flipping in a different direction or something like that. So we want to position this here inside the hand, and we'll just go to the top view to see if we can line up that elbow a little bit better. And then we have our hand here, which we'll position. And I just want to kind of rotate that into place. So rotate that this way and over like so that it's in line with the way that we had the arm before, and we'll scale that up. So this is kind of the palm of the character or creature, and we'll just rotate it into place to fit inside there. So in the front view, we still have a little bit of adjustment to be done. I'm going to move that over, and we'll go down with this a bit. Now I think it's a good time to go in and adjust where this shoulder is. We'll get a clavicle with this arm, and we want to position our shoulder with the character. It's going to be pretty important when the character deforms that this is the pivot of that. So we can move our clavicle in, and we can scale any of these up. I think for right now, they're looking okay for what they are. And we have our basic arm set up. Next, what we're going to do is just add some fingers. So to add fingers to this character, we're just going to select that palm or hand. And maybe I'll scale it down a little bit so it fits in the palm a little better. And with that selected, you can see that we have a number of digits roll out in the Modify panel. So we can set the number of digits. Our character has 3. And it will give us 3 digits there. And we can also set the number of bones that those have. So now that we have our 3 fingers, we just have to position them. The root can be moved anywhere that we want. So we'll start with this finger here, and we'll just rotate it into place. And this is definitely one area where we're going to have to take advantage of the use of our perspective views in order to position our fingers on the character so that they fit inside, because there's a lot of tumbling that needs to be done to kind of fit them correctly. Might scale this up so it's a little bit thicker. Then we have this one, which will move up a bit. This one kind of needs to be rotated towards the end. back over this way. So we have that first finger pretty well positioned for the character. And now we'll just move on to this middle one. Just select all these guys and move them up, out slightly. And I'm going to scale out this first one a bit. So we want to position this kind of where the knuckle is. And the same with this end one. We'll just kind of align this in the front axes here. And probably scale this one out a bit. I think we have the knuckle placed pretty well. To where it needs to be. And we'll make sure we get that one too. So that looks like a pretty good setup. And last but not least, we'll add this one. We'll just move them all up. By double clicking on the first joint, you can just select all of them. And usually what I'll try and do is just kind of the same with the arms or the legs. I'll just get the first and the last of these. See if I can position that well, and then you can kind of fiddle with the middle of them. It seems to be a fast way to edit the bones and get them into place pretty quickly. So that's looking pretty good. We need to get this up by the knuckle. And we'll position this a little more inside the character as well. So now we have that set up pretty well. And we can just create the arm for the other side. Now before we do that, I want to look at the ability to add some twist bones to any one of the arms or legs or anything like that. We'll do it for the forearm, but we could also do it for the upper arm if you wanted some flexibility around the shoulders or things like that. But a forearm is definitely an area on a character where you might want to add some twist bones. So you can see that in the Modify panel, if we cruise over here, we have the option of segments on this bone. So if I just increase this to 2, you'll see we'll get 2 twist bones or 3, and they start to kind of already twist so that they orient themselves properly. Now we have a graph over here where we can adjust the tangency of that twist to give it, more at the beginning than it is at the end, or something like that, and adjust different values and how strong they are. I'm just going to leave it at the default right now, but this is a great place to get some automatic twisty bones for your character, and usually they perform pretty well. The reason why we're going to set that up now is because we're just going to mirror this over to the other side of the character. Before I do that, I think I'm going to scale up this bone a bit, just the clavicle, so that it's a little bit bigger, and maybe we'll work a little bit with our skin solution, and maybe also our upper arm bone there. And once I'm happy with that, we'll select this chest bone or upper backbone. That's the hub, and we'll say add arm. And that arm will be added to the other side. It'll all be positioned properly. We have our twist bones in there, as well as all of our fingers aligned for the character. So we have a good amount of our character already all set up here. And before we move on, let's just take a quick look. Let's just hide our character. And we can freeze that entire layer and kind of take a look at the setup that we have for our rig. And you can see we're looking pretty good. You can unhide that guy. And let's just continue on with the head of the character. When using CAT, a head is usually added with just another spine here. So I'm going to go over with this hub selected, and we're going to add a spine. And this top hub will usually be the head. So we're going to move that into place. Now this might be way too many neck links, in which case, that's fine. We can just go over to the spine, and we can say, all right, well, you know what, we really only want 3 of those, or whatever it is that we want. With a different character, we may only want 1, and you can kind of adjust that there if you want to. I'm probably going to go with 3 or 4, just so that we can have some, because this character actually has a pretty long neck. And position that in there. Rotate this into place and move it up a bit. And let's just adjust in the left viewport the spine of this character's neck here, so we can position these just so that they fit in with the character a little bit better. And that actually looks pretty good. They're a little bit thin here in the back, so we'll scale them up, just so that when we actually use the skin modifier, hopefully we'll get some better results out of the envelopes. And we really want this to be kind of positioned near the cranium of the character. So I think something like that is pretty good. Now this particular character has kind of a rigid skull-like shape, and let's just take a look at what that is there. We'll unfreeze this and let's just hide our bones. Select that character. Get out of Alt-X here. So we can see we have this kind of fairly rigid bony skull, and we have kind of 2 jaws going on here, and that may be something that we want to try and set up, one that kind of goes down this way, or maybe one that just controls the entire thing, because it looks like they may or may not be autonomous of each other. But we'll set up the first one and then we'll look at the second. We'll freeze him again and bring back our bones. And we're going to select that head hub. And for this, we're not going to add a spine or something else like that. Actually, what we're going to add is just an extra bone. So you can see on really any bone itself or on one of these hubs, you have the option to add a bone. And this will add just any sort of random bone. So you can really create custom, wings and horns and facial rigs with this type of setup, which is what we're going to do now. So I'm just going to click on Add Bone. And one thing that can be tricky is you see it will get added right here. And you can position this bone wherever you want. So I'm just going to position it down here, and this is going to be the start of our jaw. We'll scale that out. And in the front, we're going to want this to be pretty big. We'll just scale that back a little bit and move it up here. And you can see that this is actually linked to my skull. So when this moves, that will move as well. And we're going to do the same thing with this bone. And I'm going to say, this is going to control the jaw of the character, this lower jaw, but it may actually control both of them. We'll have to see exactly where we want to go with that. So with that selected, we'll click on Add Bone, and another bone will get added, which is going to be parented to that first piece. And we'll just rotate this into place, scale it out. And I think I just might scale this back in a little bit, because we have this one little piece at the end, and I think that's probably part of the entire jaw, and I don't know that it would move autonomously, but we'll add another bone for that anyhow, just in case we want some more flexibility in the rig afterwards. It's always good to add that now. So now we have that small piece, which we can skin to. It's like a pretty scary mouth, so we may want to have as much articulation as we can. So now what we can see, if I just hide the character here quickly, is we have this jawbone, which is going to affect all that, and it's parented properly. So that can all be skinned for our character. We'll add another one here, bring our character back, and we want to kind of set the root back to this skull. And we'll just create a quick 1 or 2 bones for this kind of inside little jaw that we have of the character. We'll rotate that into place. Make sure we have that pivot where we want it. And we'll just scale it up to where that next piece would be. Looks like it would go down to there. Then we'll add another bone. Rotate that forward. So we have this for the character. And I'm going to select both of them and just scale them out like so. So now we have these two. Let me just hide our character. And as this moves, both of those will move, and we can have that set up there, and this one working independent of that as well, which will be good. And while you see that Cat will assign different colors to all your bones, that's all customizable. So, we can select all of this, these guys here, and we can just say, okay, well, because that's the inner bone there, we can just change the color of that. And maybe this is too close to the head, so we'll just make the head a different color so that we have something set up there, and then our jaws are pretty distinguishable from each other. And let's just bring back that mesh, unfreeze it, Alt-X so we can kind of see. And that looks pretty right. So we have one more piece to kind of set up for this nostril, and we can go through and do that. So we'll do the same thing we were doing before. We'll grab this, choose Add Bone, and add just a couple bones for the snout here. Push that through there, scale it out a bit. Just add a little bit of a bend to this and scale it so that it fits properly. Maybe it gets a little bit thinner and longer there. Comes out for the snout of the creature. Okay, so now we have a good deal of the face and the jaw set up. We'll just hide this and take a look at our rig. Okay, so next what we're going to do is add a couple of facial features for this character as far as the bones go. So we're going to bring back the head. And one thing that we want to add is going to be these horns here. Now, I don't know that the horns will flex too much, but we may want the ability to adjust them as far as where they are at the root of the head and things like that, just to give the character a little bit more, well, character. So we're going to go back to selecting this skull here and choose Add Bone. And we're going to do very similar to what we did for the two jaws that we added. And just rotate that out. So probably add maybe 2 or 3 of these just so that they fit properly. And I've been scaling these, but you can always just adjust their parameters here in the Modify panel as well. They both kind of do the same thing. Position that there. And once I'm happy with that, I'll choose Add Bone again. We'll rotate this one into place. And maybe just scale it down a bit. Then we'll add one more bone. And scale that up for the horn. Now this is actually a great feature of Cat, the ability to just copy and paste entire symmetrical bone chains over to the other side of the character. So what we're going to do is we'll select the skull again, and we're going to say Add Bone. And that's going to add this bone over here, which we'll just move over to the side. And then we're going to select the root of that new bone chain that is the horn. And we're going to say Copy Bone Settings. And we'll select this root. And we're going to say Paste Bone Settings or Mirror. And you can see not only will we get that first bone, but it creates all the other bones for us. So this is really handy for facial rigging type stuff. And we can kind of do that over with the eye. So what I'm going to do is just unfreeze our character and get out of Alt-X so that we can see what's going on here. I'll also hop into here and make sure that we have some pretty good settings and get out of Edge Faces mode. Go back into smooth highlights so that we can really see the detail of the mesh. And now we're just going to kind of circle around the character to see where we'd want to add maybe a bone for the eyebrow here on both sides. So this is still going to want to be attached to the hub or the skull of the character. And in that case, I'm going to go and just, we'll Alt-X this guy again. And we'll add our new bone. And that's going to show up right there. We'll just freeze this to keep it out of our way. And then we're going to position it over on the eye. So we're really going to want to scale this down quite a bit. So it's a pretty small detail. And then we're going to unfreeze this guy. Get him out of Alt-X so that we can really position this well. Kind of on the surface of the character. Move that into place there. Just kind of move it up and rotate it. So this might be the brow of the character. We'll just align that like so. And I usually like to move these out a bit because once I am animating, you're going to want to have access to this pretty easily and readily. So we'll kind of move that there. And this will be kind of that portion. And just to give us a little more control, I think we'll actually make this a 2-bone chain. So I might move this over here. And we'll rotate this to be kind of the back portion of this eye. We'll add another bone. And we'll rotate that down. So that can be the front. So if we needed to get a little grimace or growl out of the character, we could easily do that in this meaty part. And then we have these two set up here. So now with those set up, we'll just hide this guy. Go here, and we'll say add bone. That bone will pop up over here, and we'll do the same thing that we did with the horns. So we'll grab this guy, we'll copy it, we'll go over here, and we'll say paste mirrored, and that's going to make our nice kind of eyebrow bones for the character. Now I'll probably take both of these guys and just double click to select them all and just change their color so that they're easy to recognize for my eye controls or eyebrow controls. And then we can have that guy set up, and we can go in and we can add a little bit more detail under the eye as well. And that's all linked and controlled and moving to the skull of the character. And then we can go in and animate any one of these very simply as well, and animate that very easily too. So now that we have this guy pretty well set up, I think we'll go ahead and skin the character. So we're going to select the character, and we'll add a skin to it, just so we can kind of see what's going on here. And then we're going to choose add to add all of our bones. So this is actually a good setup here when this comes up. You want to make sure that the helpers are not necessarily displayed, because the platform and the IK helpers are not something that you want. And you can always just type in cat and select all those cat bones, and they'll pop in there. And now what we're going to do is just add an automatic skin pose with cat. So we can select just the platform here, and we'll go over to the motion panel. And here we're going to add in our cat motion so that we can just see the character walking, and it really helps to define what you want to do with envelopes. So under this ABS layer, I'm just going to go and click this running man or cat motion layer, and then we can automatically just press play. And what we should get is the character going through a quick walk cycle. So we can see how the character is walking and what's deforming and what we want to add and adjust for the skinning. So I can see here that maybe we want to go into skin and just adjust how some of these envelopes affect our character. I can move this out a bit. That should probably affect the leg a little bit more, like so. And we can do that on the other side as well. Or we'll just actually copy and paste this. So we'll copy that and we will paste that over. So on the other side that performs a little bit better. And I'm not going to get too much into skinning here. Really just the rigging aspect and how you can set up your cat character. But I think that's a pretty good setup for a custom character and using Cat to add bones, add facial bones, and additional bones to the basic arms and legs there of Cat. So the next thing that we're going to look at is adding some muscles to this character using Cat Muscle. Before we get into adding muscles to our character, I just want to take a quick look at the basics of how these muscles work that come with Cat. So if we go to Create Helpers and then choose Cat Objects, you'll see that we have a cat muscle and a cat strand. Now, the cat strand is actually a little bit more what you might think of as a muscle, and the way that you create them is if I just hop into the front view here, by dragging out 4 points. You have a start point, and then you're going to drag out a little Bezier handle, and then you're going to click again to point that Bezier handle, and then you're going to have one more and a last Bezier handle, and it's going to create a number of spheres in between those that is going to be our muscle. Now there are a few different places that you can select. Basically, these dummy objects at the end, muscle strand end, will move the entire muscle. So if you select either one of them, you can move one end, or if you select them both at the same time, you can move kind of the entire object. You can also move the entire object just by selecting the actual muscle strand. So everything's kind of parented here for ease of use. You also have this kind of controller here, which you can see behaves very much like a Bezier handle. So we can move these to kind of deform or position the muscle as we would want to on our rig. And if I just break out here, we can move in any direction as well. If I just go into the Modify panel with any part of that muscle selected, you can see that there's a bunch of different parameters to adjust. The first one is whether this is going to behave as a mesh or a bone, and that's really has to do with skinning, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. But basically, if you want this to be selectable with skin, you need to make these bones, and it will make a bone for every one of these spheres. And if you want to use something like skin wrap, you can choose mesh here. I have basic muscle properties, whether it's a left, right, or a middle muscle, and the mirror axes, and whether I actually want to see these handles. Sometimes if you have a lot of objects in the scene, a lot of muscles, you may not want to see these handles, and you can also adjust their size so that they're easily selectable. You can adjust the number of spheres. So if you're going to do a bones setup, it's really pretty good idea to start to adjust these. And that is because you're going to get a bone or an envelope for each one that you select. So you may want to go down to just 3 different spheres so that you just get 3 bones or envelopes in your skin selection. Or if you need finer detail, you can make this a lot finer. I don't see much need for going too far past 7. Under that we have our profile curve, and this is just how it is scaling these guys. So after you've positioned and everything like that, you can adjust the profile of this in any way that you want to be heavy on one end, heavy on the other, and you can even add in more points. So if we want to go in and add in a point, we can bring that in and kind of adjust these there. So it gives you a lot of flexibility as to the shape of the muscle, editing the profile curve. Under that we have squash and stretch, and basically how much we'll be able to squash and stretch this as we move these pieces away from each other and whatever angles they reach. So you can see that's with squash and stretch enabled, and if we disable it, it's just going to kind of keep the same size. So usually for setup you want to have that disabled, and once we go into animation we'll start enabling the squash and stretch. So those are the basic things that are about this muscle strand here. And let's just take a look at the other muscle type. So I'm going to delete this, and let's just hop into Perspective View, go to Create, Helpers, Cat Objects, and create a cat muscle. What this does is creates a muscle plane. And this is really useful for adjusting things like shoulders and other areas that get strange pinching. You basically would, conform this to the shape of any larger, maybe a pec muscle or the shoulder muscle, in order to retain the shape and form underneath the mesh. This is made up of a bunch of control points as well. You can see that you have endpoints, And it behaves pretty much like a patch surface. If you go in, you can see that we'll set edge faces, and this is made up of a bunch of different planes. If I start to move them this way, you can kind of see how they deform. So basically we have our corner points, and then we have our Bezier handles, which will adjust the way that those are set up. And we can adjust the tessellation or resolution of this pretty easily. So let's just go over to modify. And you can see that we have a lot of the same stuff that we had for the strand. We have whether you want them to be bones or mesh. And if they're bones, you're going to get a bone for each one of these pieces. And you can see how they're kind of broken apart there. And if they're mesh, then they'll kind of be all one piece. Under properties, we can adjust the length and width segments of how many we get. So if you need this to be smoother for some reason, particularly with skin wrap, then you may want to adjust those there. So you can adjust how many length and width segments you have. And the same parameters for whether it's a left, middle, or right muscle, and the mirror axes. We have our visible handles, and whether we want to see handles that go towards the middle as well. So if you need a little bit more control, you can say that you want to see those middle handles and position those too. I usually leave them off. Now, one thing that this muscle has that the strand does not have is this really cool collision detection. And this allows us to have sliding skin. And you may actually use this in conjunction with the strand muscle. So if you had the strand muscle underneath this type of muscle, you could have some sliding skin over it, because you'd still get the deformation, but it wouldn't pull all the vertices with the skin wrap. So let me just adjust this slightly. And I'll bring all these guys in together. Like so. And just move these up to just try and start to shape something that might look like a muscle. And I'm just going to give us some more segments to deal with. And we'll change our color too. Okay, so here is our muscle setup. And I want to take a look at using some deformers. So we're going to use something real simple. We'll just use a sphere. So let's grab a sphere. And I don't know that we need that many. If you're going to use proxy objects or things that are riding underneath or being collision objects, it's a good idea to keep the polygon count as low as possible, because those are going to create collisions. And now we'll select our muscle. Under collision detection, we're going to choose add, and we'll pick our sphere. So now our sphere is in there. And as we move the sphere, you can see that it's deforming the mesh above it. So this will kind of slide over. And depending on what kind of mesh resolution you have and what you need there, we'll just crank this up so that we can really see it sliding over. But I wouldn't really recommend being at this higher resolution. Usually you can get pretty good sliding skin at a lower res. So you can see that this will deform underneath it. So for instance, if you had, some sort of muscle or joint object that was underneath, either a strand or just a basic primitive object like this sphere, you can adjust that, and this stuff will slide underneath. And then what you would want is to have skin wrap, this being deformed by the skin wrap there, so that you can have these things kind of going underneath there, which is really pretty neat. And you can work from the other side as well. So if we come in here, one way that you need to do for this is to go into the object, select the collision object, and you want to say invert. And that way it's going to invert whatever it is that you have, and it'll kind of push in from the top. So this is really pretty cool, and we'll be doing something like this for our character, so that we can take that rock and we can sit it on top of their shoulders, and you can deform pieces like that. So not only can you take this from a muscle bulging out system, but if you had something that was going to punch your character in the face, or they were going to lean up against something with a very large stomach or something like that, you can have these different collision objects affect it, which is really pretty nice. So that's the basics of setting up your these two different muscle objects and some things that you can do with them. there's really a lot that you can do, and we'll just continue on and add some muscles to our character next. So now that we have the basic rigging and simple skinning done on this character, I'd like to take a look at putting some muscles using cat muscle. So we can see this character kind of walking here. We're going to add some muscles to this leg. So let's just hop into the layer manager, and we'll turn on the muscles layer, which doesn't have anything in it yet, and just check it so that's the active layer. And let's also hide our skin so that we're just looking at the bones setup. Now we want to set up our muscles in the kind of standard pose for our rig and not the animated pose right away. So let's just go into the motion panel and turn off animation mode so that the character is still here in the front. We're going to set these up from the back, so change to the back view. And we're going to go over to Create, Helpers, and choose Cat Objects. And here we have two different types of muscles. We're going to choose the muscle strand. And muscle strands are pretty easy. We're just going to create a muscle here for this leg. So let's just click and drag. And then we'll click one more time. And then we'll go over here. We'll click. And then we'll click one more time. And that basically sets 4 different points up for our muscle. The muscle is made up of these different spheres in the center. And if we just go into wireframe, you can see it has this kind of Bezier helpers that control it. You have this piece, which will control kind of the arc of that muscle, as well as this one on this side. And then you have the end point, and those were the 4 points that we created when we created this muscle. So if we just go back into smooth highlights, I want to align this with our character's leg. So what I'm going to do is just select the end point here, and then I'm going to go up and choose Quick Align. And I'm going to align that point to that portion of the leg. And then we'll select the other bottom point here, and we're going to quick align that to this top leg. And that should kind of position it to where we want it. And now we can just kind of go in and adjust the way that we want this to look. And we may want to toggle the skin on and off for this, and just kind of move this, Bezier handle back and forth so that we can adjust how this is going to work. So probably like that. And I may want to bring this down just so that I get a little bit better angle for deforming when we're bulging. And let's just toggle the character on and off so we can kind of see what's going on here. So we may want to move that up there and just position it however you like. You can also change the color if you wish to something that is more muscle-like. And the next thing to do is just link these 2 controller objects to the portion of the leg or the body that you want, and I'm just going to link them to the bone. So we'll grab Select and Link, and I'm going to link this one to that top bone there. Make sure that we have that correct. There we go. And we'll hop into wireframe. We'll grab this and link it over there. And we'll just do this in wireframe too, just so I can be sure that we have it linked correctly, and we do. So now when we hop back in to animation mode, and select the character, go into animation mode, this muscle should follow along with the character. Now what we'll do is just go in and add a little bit of squash and stretch to this muscle. So I'm going to select the muscle, and I'm going to go to the Modify panel, and you can see that it has a few different parameters that we can deal with here. And what we want to do is just scroll down to the squash and stretch, and we want to say Enable. And you can see it kind of stretch out there as it's long, and when it comes back, it gets squashed a bit. Now the important part about this is to kind of set where it's going to be at rest, or its relaxation state. So you kind of want to pick somewhere in the leg where it's not all the way contracted, which would be about here, and it's not all the way out, which would be kind of that touch right there. So we'll go probably maybe somewhere like 11 or 12 is kind of in the middle. And just click on Set Relaxed State, and you can see that it will set that in here. So now when the leg moves out a bit, it'll stretch, and when it moves back a bit, it will squash. And right now it's not super predominant or clear that that's happening. And that depends on a couple of different things, where it happens to be positioned on the leg and these Bezier handles as well. But what we can do is adjust the multiplier. So if we bring this all the way up to, let's say, 15, you can see in this squash state, it will really, bulge up, and at the stretch, it'll really thin out. Okay, so I don't know that 15 is actually where we want to go. Maybe we'll bring it down a little bit, but for different circumstances, it's different. So we can change this multiplier maybe back down to 10, and we can be happy with that. So now we have that set up, and that looks pretty good. What we'll do is just add the other muscle to the other side. So let's go and hop out of animation mode. And what we're going to do is we're going to make sure that we tell what side this muscle is on. So we're going to say that this is the character's right leg, which it is. So we're going to check the right. And then I'm just going to copy this muscle over here. So just shift drag, copy it, and it'll bring everything else with it. And then on this one, I'm going to tell it that this is the left muscle. And I'll go back to the right muscle, and I'll say that I want to copy the strand settings and select on this one, and we'll say paste strand settings. So this will put it in the position as well as all the correct strand settings that we just made up on the other side, which is pretty useful. So we can just hop back into wireframe and do our linking. So we'll link this muscle. We're going to link these controller objects that control the ends to the proper leg bone. And then when we hop back into animation mode, both of these should be stretching and deforming the way that we set them up. I think this is still a little bit heavy, but I think for the demo, this will work pretty well. You might, normally have a lot of different muscles set up where you have 4 or 5 in the leg and along the back, but we're just going to set up these 2 simple ones right now. Okay, so next what I want to take a look at is skinning these to the body. So when we do that, we're definitely going to want to be out of animation mode so that we're in this kind of set mode here. And let's bring our character there, and we can see the muscle and how it is set up on either side. And there's 2 ways that we can do this. If I select this muscle, you can see that the muscle can either be of a mesh or a bone type. And if it's a mesh, you want to use something like skin wrap in order to skin this to the character. If it's a bone and you're going out to some sort of game setup, it'll make each one of those little spheres a bone, which is really pretty helpful. And then you can select each one as a bone through just regular skin, and that will work and, as I said, export to your game engine. I find that it's a little easier to set them up as a mesh if you're going to be working in 3ds Max mostly, because you don't have as many envelopes to play with, and it's pretty easy to set up. So before I do that, what I'd like to do is, because this is kind of at a pumped up state already, I usually like to drop the multiplier. So we'll hide this. And before we skin it, because this is pretty close to our squashed state, I want to go into the multiplier and bring that back down to maybe half of this, or maybe even 1. So we'll set it back to 1 for both of these, just so that before we skin this, we don't have that deformation. And then we'll go back to the character here. We're going to select the character, and we're going to add a skin wrap. So I'll add a skin wrap to this guy. And we're just going to add, and I'm going to press H in order to bring up the select by name. And we want to grab our muscle strands. So they should be in here at the bottom. They're helpers, muscle strand 1 and muscle strand 2. I'm going to pick those. and now those will be deforming our character. And we can go in and adjust the vertex deformation and fall off, but if they're pretty close to the skin, they should work pretty well by default. And now when we go back, we'll select our muscle strands and we'll set that multiplier back up in the squash and stretch. And you can see that's going to bulge the layout, and that's about the amount of bulge that we'll get out of the leg. And now we can go and actually, let's just hide our character. Let's select our rig, put it back into animation mode, and we'll play this back. So there we go there. And let's just bring our character, hide our muscles, and hide our bones so that we can just see the way that the mesh deforms. And you can see that you get that muscle bulging and stretching that's deforming the mesh underneath, which looks pretty good right now. Okay, so one more thing that I want to add to this is some sort of jiggle or bounce to the muscle as it snaps into place. So let's hide our character again, bring back the bones and the muscle. And there's two different ways that we can do something like this. The first is actually on these Bezier handles. We could apply a spring controller here, and it would just kind of bounce around and affect the way that these Bezier handles move, and that would give us a little bit of jiggle on our leg. The other thing that I find maybe a little more simple is just to apply a flex modifier to this object itself. One nice thing about this muscle system is you can apply modifiers to it because it is a mesh, and you can do all sorts of things with those modifiers. So if, for instance, we wanted to add a push modifier, we could do that, and it would push this in and out. It's a little far. Pretty easily, and you could even animate that if you wanted to. Or you could apply an effect region or all sorts of other things that would kind of go with this object, which is pretty interesting. And for that, what we're going to do is just apply flex, because that's going to give us some simple, fairly fast secondary action. So I'm going to apply a flex modifier, and we'll just play this back. So you can see we really get some bounciness in that leg. And let's bring our character up and get rid of the bones. And you can see here it's really kind of bouncing the leg around. Okay. Now there's a couple things that I'd like to do for this flex. So let's just go in and hide our character. And you can see that at the root, you know, we're getting where at the end of the muscle where it would be attached to the bone, it's kind of flopping around there, which is maybe not ideal. So all we have to do is go into flex, choose edge vertices into sub-object mode, and we'll grab these guys here, hold down control, and grab these guys in the end so that these are edge vertices and only the center is going to kind of move around. And we got some nice jiggle there. Maybe too much jiggle, but we'll kind of go with that for right now. And we can just go over to the other side, and we can apply the flex modifier there. Immediately I'll hop in, go to edge vertices, and we'll grab those guys there, as well as these ones on this end. And then hop back out. So now we can bring our character back, hide our muscles, and you can see that that is definitely jumping around a bit. If you want to get a slightly better look at it, you might go in here. I'm going to set the start time to 0 and just turn off real time. Or you can actually do, you know, a preview animation so that you can see how this is playing back. I'll go back, turn real time back on. And it's a bit floppy right now, and it's also, if you take a notice, it's a bit floppy kind of right here in the front. So one thing I want to do is just kind of adjust those edges, because I'd like probably more of the action just to happen back here. We'll hide this here. We'll bring our muscles back and just go to those edge vertices, and I'll probably expand that on this edge to right about there. And we can do the same on the other side. So this way we get a little bit better control over, what's deforming and when, and maybe we'll just grab only these ones on the top here and have the bottom work or what have you. And now we can go back and you can see that we're getting much less deformation down towards the knee where we really wouldn't want it, and only on the back side of the leg here. So lastly, I would say that this is probably a little intense. It's nice to have it set up like this for the demo, but probably bring that flex down 0.5 on either side just so that it's not quite as in your face, and you'd likely have a lot more of these muscles on the character. But this is a quick and good way to kind of go up and set up some muscles for your character. You can put these, all over the body, and then you get, some nice bulging, deformation, and secondary action out of your character. And again, yeah, it's pretty cool that this stuff is included in 2011 so that you have a little bit of something to use there. In this session, we're going to take a look at adding another muscle to this character's back. So what we have here are our muscles that we just added and our character rig and the character kind of walking around. We're going to add one of these other muscles to the character's back, and we're going to actually use it to deform the character's back as a large stone comes down. So let's unhide the character, and we'll get the rig put away. And we're going to keep our muscle layer up because we're going to start building a muscle. And let's just put our character into or out of animation mode. And we'll go over to the motion panel and pop him out of animation mode so that he's kind of ready to be rigged. And then there's a couple other pieces that go to this character. So if you open up the character layer, you can see there's a couple other pieces that are hidden, and one of them is this stone object. We'll just unhide that stone object. And if we go into the Material Editor, we can just switch to Compact. And we can apply this base material to that as well, because that has all the same UVs and everything like that. So you can see that there's this stone, and this is going to kind of come to rest on the character's back. So what we're going to do is something that's a little bit interesting and different. We're going to use this muscle to actually deform the character's back inward using this as a collision object. So to do this, we first need to create our muscle. So let's hide this stone again, and we'll go in the top view, go to Create, Helpers, choose Cat Objects, and instead of a muscle strand, we're going to use this cat muscle. So let's just drag one out here in the top view that's, about the size of the character's back. And we can give it a kind of reddish color so it fits in with our muscles. And now what we want to do is set up the segments on this and position it. So these corner pieces are what we're going to use to position the 4 places on this. And if we just go and turn on edge faces, we should be able to see how many faces this has. We probably want it to be a little bit more dense than this, so let's go to the Modify panel and adjust the amount of segments that it has. We'll bring it up to something like 5 by 5, I think is good for right now. So the first thing to do is to put this in position, and we want it just basically wrapped over this character's back. To do that, I'm going to turn on snapping, and I'm going to right click here and turn off or turn on vertex snapping. And you can turn off grid point snapping if you have that on right now. And what we're going to do is just kind of snap each one of these corner points to a point on the character's mesh. So we want to kind of pick points that are going to be on the character's body. So maybe like there and there would be good points. So let's just line this guy up. And we're going to select so that when we roll over the snap, we get this little circle that's yellow. And we can pick that, and then we can snap to places on the mesh. Okay, so let's move this entire thing up. We'll turn off snap to do that, and over just so it's, kind of closely aligned with the character. And now what we can do is we can grab these pieces. We'll turn snap back on by pressing S, and we can snap to different points on the character's mesh. So we want to maybe snap to right there for that piece, and on the other side to the same place. So we'll grab this. You want to make sure that you grab this little yellow circle, and we're going to position that there. And we'll do that on these 4 pieces towards the end here. And I think I'll just pick this piece on the back that kind of comes to a point, and the same place on the other side, which is right here. So we'll grab that, just kind of snap it there. Now you can see that the mesh is definitely underneath the character, so if we just go into wireframe, you can see that we really need to adjust the kind of Bezier handles that work with this. So we can get into doing that right now. Let's just go to helpers, so that we'll only select helpers. We can turn off snapping and select these helpers and start to move them into place. So we'll grab those 2 and we'll grab these 2 and start to kind of position them and move them into place. And then let's just go over here, and if we press F3, then we should be able to see that there. And we can take these and maybe move them out a little bit so that we have it positioned on the character's back. And of course there are the other ones in the top here that we may need to move out. So we'll select those helpers, kind of move them out so that they conform to the back a little bit better. And the same with the ones on the top. Just pressing F3 here to toggle, and we want to grab these 2 Bezier-like handles, move those up, and then we can kind of toggle it to get that into where we want. And now we'll go into the left view and adjust this a little bit more. So something like that. Bring this up, something like that. So it doesn't have to be super precise, but just so that it's wrapping around the character's back. So now we're going to use this deforming muscle to deform the character's back, and we're going to use a stone collision object to kind of come down and flatten out the character's back. Now before we get to skinning this and bringing in the collision object, it's going to be a good idea to bind this to the rig. So let's go back to our layers palette, bring the bones back, and just hide the mesh for right now. And as we've seen, the things that control these muscles are these little dummy helpers here, and move it. So these are what we want to link to some piece on the rig. And the nice part is, of course, just like the legs, we can link them to wherever the corresponding piece is. So if the character twists its spine or does something else like that, the muscle should move properly. So we can kind of link these to the portion on the spine. Make sure that you are out of helpers only selection mode. So I'm just going to go into the left view, make sure that I have both of these guys selected, and hit it like that. And I'll press F4 to turn on edge faces, because that'll give me a better idea of what it's actually linked to. I can see the little flash, and I'll select these 2 and we'll link them to this portion of the character, or actually maybe back here because this is a little closer to the back. So let's just check this out. We'll select the character and go to the motion panel and press play, and we can see that muscle deforming and working with the character's rig, which is exactly what we want. Next, let's just bring our character back, and we can hide our rig for now because it's all linked up to where we want it to. And we're going to start working with this muscle. So let's bring our stone in so that we can create a collision object for it. And we could just use the stone, but you really would prefer to use some sort of proxy object so that we don't have, a real complicated mesh to calculate moving in as a collision object here. So let's just go and create a box. We'll go in the top view. And just drag out a box. And that's on the muscle layer right now, and that'll be okay for now. We'll probably put it on the rig layer later. Just move this up, and what I'm actually going to do is let's quick align this to that box, and then we'll need to kind of rotate it into place a little bit because the orientation of the box is a little bit off. So we'll just rotate this so that it kind of fits in the general shape of the stone that's going to sit on top of the back of the character. So go into the left view, and we'll rotate that there. We'll use the local coordinate system for that. We can rotate this down. And in the perspective, we can do, some small modifications if we want, until we're happy with the basic shape. So really all we're looking for this to be is a simple collision object in order to have it seem like when this stone drops on the character's back, the back muscles have to kind of spread out, and some of these delts will, push out to the side and things like that. Okay, so now that we have this collision object, we're going to add it into the muscle as a collision object. So let's go back to our layers and just hide the stone for right now so that we're just dealing with this object here. We'll select the muscle and we can call this back muscle. Scroll down a bit, and this is a middle muscle, so that's fine. And you can see we have collision detection. We'll click on add and choose this. Now one thing that you'll notice is if we toggle into wireframe mode, that basically what happens is this kind of gets sucked on to the box because it thinks that it's pushing through the box, which is fine. We just need to kind of orient it, and so you can see it's actually pushing through from this side. So on the muscle, we're going to scroll down and use the option, select the box as the collision object, and we're going to say invert. And let's just select this box and call it stone proxy. And now what you'll see is when this comes in from this side, it's going to push down. The only tricky thing in here is, as far as the invert goes, for some reason it's flipped the normals. So if we hop in a wireframe, you'll see that it doesn't start pushing until it hits this side. So all we really need to do is apply a normal modifier to our box, and that flips the normals, and then it will push on this side. So now we have this stone proxy object that'll come in and start deforming this muscle and pushing out the mesh once we skin it. So we can see that here. It pushes that in there. One thing I like to do with these objects is go into display and set it to display as a box. That way I can easily see how this is deforming that muscle in places. If we just hide our entire character, when we look from here, we can see how this is flattening out that mesh. Okay, so now what we need to do is bind this all together. So let's bring back our stone and line this up. And we're just going to take the stone object and link it to the stone proxy. So now when that object moves, we'll move that stone down. Okay, and we can hide that stone for now again. And the last thing that we'll do here is skin our mesh. So we're pretty happy with the way that the muscle is moving and all the rest of that stuff. We'll add this to the skin wrap of the mesh. So it is important that we're in our standard T-pose here. We're out of animation mode while we do this. So we're going to select the character. We'll hop in to our skin wrap and we'll say add. And what we want to add is that muscle. So the back muscle gets added there. And then we can pop out. We can adjust some of the parameters, but I think in general it's probably going to deform the mesh, so we can kind of see that coming in and deforming the character. I don't think that we're going to go that extreme, but we're going to kind of push it in a little bit. We can bring the stone back, and you'll see that the stone is actually curved underneath, so while we do want to push this in a bit, I think we want to adjust the stone so that it will fit better on the character, and you can do that by just moving the stone down slightly so it fits on the character and we still get that deformation from the character. So something like that I think is pretty good. Now, what we want to do is actually move this into place and have the character kind of come into form. And what we'll need to do is just blend between our, non-deforming state and our deforming state. To do that, I'm just going to move this entire piece back here. And we're going to bring our bones back in. Go and select our character's rig, and we want to have this go into animation mode. And we're also going to want to make sure that we link this piece right here for our stone proxy to the character so that it follows along with the character. So one thing that I like to do is this guy just kind of snaps into a pose. And for any of these simulations that we're doing with muscles, or were we to do cloth later to simulate some of the other pieces coming off, you kind of want all this to blend into shape pretty easily in the beginning. So let's go in here. And we're going to try and make that sort of animation. I'm going to set the timeline to have a negative space. So we'll go with -10. And we're going to blend between two different layers. So we already have our cap motion layer on here just to kind of see what the skinning is, and we'll just say that that's what we're going to use for the character walking and at least our tests. We want to add in another layer, so let's add an absolute layer. And let's press play here. So what you can see is we have the absolute layer, and unless that is off or the global weight is set down to 0, we won't see any of the animation that we have here. Okay, so let's hop back out of there and make sure that we have this guy all rigged up on the back. We want to link this to a portion of the character's bones. So we'll make sure that we have that linked. So we're going to take this, and we can link it maybe to this center back piece, or depending on where we want it to sway, but we'll go with that for right now. And then we can bring this back in. When we go back into cap motion, that should snap into place and be moving along with the character, which is what we want. So to get this to kind of blend between this action and this action, all we're going to do is animate that global weight. It's a pretty easy way to blend between the layers. So we'll go to maybe 0, which will give us a good amount of time. I don't think that we'll need that for this type of animation, but if we started to do things with cloth or other things, we might want a little time to settle into the pose. So, we're going to bring this down to 0. And set the global weight to 100 here. So now we have this keyframe, and it kind of blends in up there. And we could probably just give us some time for things to settle in and just have that blend be over a few frames there. So maybe we'll make that at frame -5 or -6. And then what we're going to do is move this piece into place. So we'll go over to the left view, and we're going to move it on the local axes between 0 and 5 so that everything is kind of settled into place there. So we're going to push this down on the character. You can see his back kind of flattening out there and flattening out on the other side. And we'll move it back up in the beginning. So now we have this animation of that settling into place. We'll get rid of the keyframe at 0 if there was one there. And now we have the character kind of moving around. Might bring it up a little bit more. He's a little bit squashed. Okay, so now what we've done is we've added a second or third muscle to the character that is actually deforming the character's muscle from outside objects, which I think is a pretty interesting way to use these muscles. Traditionally, you'd be putting them maybe on the shoulders or the neck so that they deform from the inside out. But this is an interesting way to use it because if you had a character with, you know, a large stomach or something like that, and you needed them to bend over a rail, you could push that stuff in using these deforming objects that are muscles, and I think that's a pretty cool way to use it. And we've also kind of blended in between our skin pose and moved some of those dynamic objects into place, and then started that animation going. The next thing I want to do is just add a little bit of a jiggle to this piece. So this piece, may flop around a little bit even though it's a heavy rock on the character's back, and we want that to, affect the muscle and affect some other stuff that's in the scene. Now the thing we used to do that on these muscles down here was flex, and we could certainly do that for this as well, but we'll just take a look at using a spring controller for, just a taste of something different. So let's go back to our frame 0 here, turn off auto key, and just for the sake of it, we'll pop this character out of animation mode, just so that we make sure that we're not mucking anything up. Now to add some secondary action to this, we're just going to grab the control proxy object, go to animation, position controllers, and choose a spring controller. Now you'll notice one thing about this, and that's that when you add that spring controller, the object moves to the parent space of whatever it happens to be linked to, which is the spine bone in this case. If we want to, we can put another controller in between so we don't get that type of thing, and we'll look at that in a moment. But for right now, I'm just going to actually move this back into place, into the general position that we wanted. And we'll want to set up our animation for it again because this will have frozen our transform. So we're going to move this down, back into place over those first few frames. Just until we're happy with the positioning on the character. Now when the character walks, we should have some secondary action from the spring controller, which is going to get propagated down. So let's go in and put our character back into animation mode. And you can kind of see this guy flop around a little bit. We can make it a little bit more intense by selecting the proxy object, going into the motion panel, and scrolling down to the spring dynamics. We can adjust things like the mass and drag, so we just set this mass up to 800. You'll see that this will really flop around on the character's back. And I think maybe it's a little heavier than that, so we could bring that maybe back down to 400 or something. And as this is flopping around, there should be the interaction and collision that will be deforming the muscle and deforming the character's back. Now, I wanted to show this without having to put in the little extra node for the spring controller, because you can put that in and just move it into place, just because I wanted it to be straightforward and not too confusing as to what we're doing. But now I want to go back and add in that controller because it's a little more clean workflow, and it will probably help you out a bit. So I'm going to go back to that scene. And you'll see that we have all the same stuff going on here, but we haven't added our spring controller quite yet. Before I do add the spring controller, what I'm going to do is create a small helper object. So I'm just going to go into helpers and choose a dummy or a point object. We'll choose a point object, and I'll just click that there. I'll give the point a box just so that it has something that I can see. And I'm going to name this stone, spring. Now what I'm going to do is just kind of put this in the middle of the rig. So I'm going to go into our layers. Let's get rid of the mesh right now because we don't need that. And we actually don't need to worry about the muscles either. I would say that now this piece is becoming more part of the rig. So we'll go to bones and we'll add it to that and hide the muscles. And I can see that I created my point helper on the muscles layer as well, so I'll add that in too. So now what I want to do is I want to take this point helper and I'm going to align it to our box in both position and orientation. Okay, so now these have the same position and orientation, and I'm just going to put this in the middle of the hierarchical chain. So this was linked directly to this back piece, and now what we're going to do is just link this to that and then to the back piece. And that what'll happen then is when we apply the spring controller, this is the orientation that it will take on. So we're going to link that to that, and then this to the character's back. Now you can see that when we select this, we can go to the animation menu, position controllers, and choose spring. And because it's aligned and linked to this little spring controller object, we'll just call it control because it's not actually the object with spring. It's just allowing us to have that in the correct position. Then we can have that there. Now the one thing that we are going to want to do is position this again. So this will kind of have to move in and animate. So let's unhide the other pieces, at least the character here. And we can move this spring down, and that's what we're going to want to animate, that spring control, because that's what everything is linked to. And then between 0 and 5, we'll move this down here. You can see it push the character's back out. Move it up there, and just get rid of that 0 keyframe that's made by default because we're working in negatives. Then just let's grab this platform, turn on our animate, and you can see we have that spring happening there, which is affecting the character's muscle and the back. And we can go back in to the spring and change those properties that we had before. So maybe make this 450 just to make it a little bit more bouncy so we can kind of see it here in the viewport. And it comes along with the character. So in this section we've added another muscle to the character that's doing something a little bit different. It's actually acting as a collision object. We're skin wrapping into the character and we're having that collide with an outside object that would kind of deform the flesh, not necessarily the muscle, but the flesh of the character as this stone, heavy stone, kind of comes down on the character's shoulders. We also added some secondary action, this time with a spring controller instead of using the flex modifier, but you could definitely do it with the flex modifier too. It just depends on what you're more comfortable with. We saw that when you apply a spring controller, it's usually pretty good to have a intermediate object parented so that you don't get that shift in position, which can be really helpful. Lastly, we did a little pose to animation blend here using our cat layers. So when we hopped in here, we added a new absolute layer and we blended that entire pose in, which is really useful for moving objects into place before the character starts to animate, especially if you need simulations of muscles or hair or deformation or anything like that. And I think that's it for adding some muscles to our character. In this section, we're going to take a look at the Slate Material Editor. In 3ds Max 2011, Autodesk shipped a new material editor called Slate. This material editor is used for node-based material modifications and wiring different materials together so that you can kind of see a schematic result. You'll definitely notice that this exists because if you pop into 3ds Max 2011, the default is to use the Slate Material Editor. So if I just press my handy M hotkey, you'll see this come up. Now this is a possibly daunting interface, but we'll go through all these different tools and panels and show you everything that's in here. Now you can definitely tell one thing, and that's this material editor does take up a lot of room. As it's a visual node-based material editor, there needs to be a certain amount of screen real estate dedicated to it. If you want to get back to the old material editor, there's a couple of different ways to do that. If I just launch this, then you can see that the first menu here is the modes menu, and you could just choose the compact material editor, and this will be here to work with as you may be used to working with it. So if you open that up and you get scared and afraid by that material editor, then you can just go to modes and toggle back. The other place to get this is, of course, from the material editor button. So if I just click on this and hold, you'll see there's a flyout here. And if I choose compact material editor, then that'll be chosen. And if this is what I want to work with, once that button is chosen, it'll toggle whichever the last material editor I was using. So a lot of times if I'm setting up a quick scene, I like to use the compact to just drag and drop materials and put in quick maps. But once they start getting a little bit more complex, I think it's a good idea to start using the Slate Material Editor. And the more that you use it, the more making basic materials will be easy for you to do there. So the last place we can toggle between these is under the rendering menu, material editors, and we can choose either one. So I'm going to go back into Slate because that's what we'll be looking at. You can see that we're presented with a bunch of different panels. We have this panel here, which is going to be our node view. And immediately, let me just drag in a material. So I'm just going to choose a standard material and drag it over there. And you can see this is what the nodes look like and how they exist in that view. Over to the left, we have our material map browser. And you can click on materials as well as maps and other things like controllers. And you also have your scene materials, which we don't have any in the scene right now, but momentarily we will, and sample slots. So you can see this gives you a little rollout of the sample slots that you have in Max, and you can make this larger or smaller. So if you're used to using these little sample slots, then you can just kind of adjust this so that that will work for you, and you can double click or drag and drop on these to bring them in the view as well. This material map browser also has a nice search capability up here, so we can go and type in something like blend, and you'll see that there's the blend material there. Or if we typed in multi, you'd see multi-sub-object and multi-output channel texture map. And we could just grab whichever one we wanted from there. So this is a nice fast way to kind of look for different maps. If we wanted to find our noise map, we could just type this in. If you're a little more accustomed to working that way instead of surfing through all of the different rollouts here. So the next thing we're going to do is actually just assign this material to an object. And to do that, we can just select the node, and you can do your kind of standard assign material to selected. So if I just move this over to the side here, you see I have my selected teapot, and you can see we have assign material to selection here. And that will add that material to that object. Also, if we wanted to get a material from a selected object, we could grab our picker and go in and pick that, and you can see that that material would show up here in our view as well. So let me just undo that a couple times. And another way to assign a material in the Slate Material Editor is to drag the output. So you can drag this output to a lot of different places. One will be to this object in the scene, and then that will assign that material there. If I wanted to assign a map or a material to somewhere else in Max, I could also just drag that out to anywhere in Max. So let's take a look at this with a map. We'll just go in here and go into Maps and choose something that we might put into our environment. So pretty standardly, we might grab a gradient, and that might be something that you pipe into the environment slot. So let's just open up the environment and effects and drag that into here. So you can see that you can drag into any map slot, and we'll just say that we want that to be a standard gradient. And we're going to instance that map. So now when we render that, we get that material assigned to our teapot and the gradient in the background, which has been set to screen. Now, if we want to go ahead and edit any of the parameters from either one of these, either the map or this material, all you have to do is just double click on the node, And what will happen is all of its parameters will load up into the parameter editor. You can see that these rollouts are very familiar and they're very similar to what you might be used to editing in the original or compact material editor. So if I want to change this color to purple and just adjust the specular level or something like that, then I can do that. And I can work in a similar way to what I might have done before. If I didn't want to wire in things here, I could go into the maps rollout and I could adjust some of those things there. And the same thing with our gradient map. So if I wanted that to be a cylindrical environment and just change this to a little bit more of a blue, then I could do that there, and you see that'll update here in our render. So I'll just close out of that. And the other pane that you see here is our navigator pane. So you can see that we can adjust this. If we have a bunch of different nodes, then just like you might use this in Photoshop or something like that, you can easily navigate to any one of those nodes, which is really pretty helpful. So a little bit later, when we have many more of these to deal with, then you'll see how that becomes useful. So we could just use the same navigation keys that you might in the viewport here for zooming in and panning. And you also have these tools down here. So if you want, you can just grab in the zoom tool, a little marquee select, zoom extends selected, zoom extends the entire view, and we'll just grab that guy there. Get our select and just select that. So we could go with zoom the whole view or zoom selected, and then of course the pan tool. So you can adjust those right here in your navigation toolbar. And there's also this piece which will navigate around in the view by name, and we'll take a look at that when we have some more nodes in the view, and that'll become more useful. So that's just kind of navigating the view and what is in all these panes and how we can use them. Next we'll look at customizing these views and maybe adjusting it so that we have a little bit more screen real estate and bringing some of these panels back and forth. If we want to adjust any of these panes, we can do so either by using toolbar items, hotkeys, or just really closing these out. So you can see there's a little X next to a lot of these guys, and if we click on that X, then they'll go away. And that gives us a little more screen to kind of play with here, which is really pretty helpful. Also, you can see that that's kind of tied to a couple of these buttons. So, we can bring the parameter editor back by just pressing this toolbar button, and that the material map browser is over here as well. If we go to the tools menu, you'll see all three of the things that you can kind of hide and show here, which is the material map browser, O, the parameter editor, which is P, and the navigator, which is N. So I find myself using these hotkeys quite a bit in order to adjust what's going on in the scene. So if I just hit P, it'll bring up my parameter editor. O will hide the material map browser, and N is going to bring up my navigator. So P and N will kind of bring those guys both back. And whatever they were kind of before we hid them, they'll keep their little ratios. So usually I'll set that up like that and hide these and bring them back one at a time. So I think that's pretty useful because this is really a pretty big interface, and you want to be able to kind of customize it as much as you possibly can in order to keep as much screen real estate going and save yourself on that screen real estate. So next thing I'd like to look at is creating some groups and assigning different materials to groups so that we don't have to be kind of scrolling all the way throughout here. If you click on this little down arrow here, you can see we can make a new group, and I'm going to call this Mike. And that's just going to allow me to take any materials I want, as well as maps or controllers, and put them in this group. So I might know that I want to put the ray trace material, which I use pretty often, as well as standard and blend, and kind of pop them in here. Just reorder that. And then if I want to go into maps, I'll just scroll down some. And I'll say we definitely use a bitmap a lot, cellular map, fall off, mix. I'm always using the output, and we'll just drag maybe our noise map up there if we haven't already. Nope. So I can kind of customize that. And I could do this with controllers too. So if I go into controllers, maybe float controller, maybe an audio controller, or something like a noise float controller, I would use quite a bit. So I'll put that one in there, and that will kind of save out there. So now I can really customize what I have here, and that way I can quickly start to add different nodes very easily without surfing through this huge material map browser. The other thing that you'll note is when I right click, I get all of these rollouts. So I get materials, maps, controllers, etc. And because I've added this new group, I get my mic group, which has all of these in it, which is really pretty handy. So let's just say I want to right click and go to mic and create a ray trace material. I can do that here, and then I can assign that to my teapot. And I'll just double click on this material to bring up the parameter editor. And I'll say, you know what, I want this really reflective. And I'm going to bring that diffuse color down to a dark blue. And we'll just render that out. And then I have my nice chrome material set up on this teapot. Now let's just take this a little further and start to add some maps here. So for my reflection, I'm just going to go in here to reflect and just drag out a new wire, which is going to give me my right click menu to add any maps that I want. So I can either go to maps and choose from here, or I actually already have a fall off map. So while Ray Trace has the ability to use like a Fresnel type effect, this will kind of give us that effect. And now when I render this out, we're going to get kind of a slightly different effect where we have the reflections happening on the glazing surfaces, which might be something that you want. So we've kind of added that in there. And then I can even go in and just go, I'll double click on this, and I can go in and I can say, all right, well, in that white area, which is here, I want to add a noise map. And in this noise map, I'll double click here, and I will bring up the high or bring down the high threshold to make it a little whiter. And you can see that propagating here. So a couple things that I can do is I can double click on this in order to make it a little bigger, so I can kind of see how that's happening. And then I'll just make the size a little smaller. And then let's see how this renders out. So now you can see that noise pattern coming in there, and while that's okay, I think I might even want it a bit smaller than that. So we'll try like a 0.3 and maybe make it fractal, just so that we kind of break up this setup there. So we get this kind of noisy type of thing going on there. And you can start to see we don't have too many things in here, but when I am in here, you can start to see where the navigator comes into play. So if we wanted to go back to that gradient map or something like that, we can navigate really easy through there. So that's how you can start to add in some maps to a basic object and drag out a few of them. We'll look at a couple of different methods of doing this besides just dragging out next. Alright, so another way that we can do the same thing as kind of drag out here and pick is we can just create something by right clicking and then drag it into one of those node slots. So let's say we're going to use a fall off map again. We'll just right click and create a fall off map. And I'm actually going to hide both the material browser and the navigator there, and I'll just zoom in. And right here, I'm going to drag that fall off map into the diffuse. And I'll just move this up here and then pan. And you can see that we get a good preview here. To expand this preview, I'm going to double click on it. And then we'll double click on this to change the color around. So if we wanted some sort of kind of interesting sheen painted color or something like that, then we could get that out of that fall off map. And one thing that you'll notice if we just hide this and kind of zoom out a bit is that we're getting the controllers for each one of these. So when I go here, you can see that we have these two Bezier controllers, and those will show up for your maps. If we just double click on this map material itself and we go into maps, you can see these are equating to the values that are over here. So if I start adjusting this, it's just between 0 and 1 instead of between 0 and 100. So we can adjust those there. Now when you first start off, you may or may not want to see these or have a use for these. There's two different ways that you can kind of do this. One is if you go to Options and Preferences, you can ask it not to show any additional parameters, which is kind of a global way of saying that you only really want to work with these maps here. Another way to do this is to right-click on any one of these rollouts and just say Hide Child Trees, and then those will be hidden. Lastly, if we just go into additional parameters, we can right-click on anywhere that's kind of blank here, and this will give us this big rollout, and we can go into Hide All. So let me actually just right-click up here so we can get the whole rollout. And under Show Hide Slots, we can go to Additional Parameters, Maps, and then we can say Show All or Hide All. And what that'll do is instead of hiding them one by one, it'll hide them continuously. So if you see, what we did was we just right-clicked and said, Hide Child Trees. And if I go in and let's just drag out a glossiness, and for the glossiness, I'll just use cellular. You see that we'll get that cellular because we really just hid what was currently there. If we do what I just explained and go to Hide Slots, Additional Parameters, and say under Maps, we want to Hide All, then what we'll do is it will hide all those maps. So we can just select on these controllers because we don't need them anymore, and I'll press Delete. And we'll just click and drag to disconnect that one, and we'll add a luminosity. So now if I add a luminosity map, which is this noise, you can see that that won't pipe out. And that's usually the way that I like to work, is to because then I still get the additional parameters options, and I don't have all those additional maps. And if I need to drag out a map, I can do that some other time. So that's a little bit about navigating using the additional parameters. Next, we'll take a look at actually using more of these additional parameters instead of going out to the parameter editor as much. So to do that, what I'm going to do is we'll just re-render this to kind of take a look at how our teapot looks here. And you can see I want to edit these noise parameters. I'm going to press P to get rid of that parameter editor and then go into additional parameters. And you can see we have things like our noise colors and our noise size. We can use this spinner and just drag down to bring that noise size down. And when we render this out again, we'll see that noise size start to come down. I can also double click here on any value, and I can say, you know what, I think I want this to be 0.5, and we'll render that out. And also, if I wanted to adjust things like the low threshold to make this a little bit more dark and contrasting, as well as the high threshold will make it a little more contrasting. Now we're starting to introduce like little flakes in here, so I think I'll just kind of adjust that down so we don't have quite as many of those. And if for some reason we are off to the side and kind of playing with a lot of different materials here and we can't see that slot, or you just want it to be bigger, you can always right click and you can say Open Preview Window, and you can set that preview window anywhere you want. You can also make it a bit bigger. So if we were playing with this and we were over here, you could always go in and adjust the noise size or something like that and keep that preview window up, which is pretty handy. You can also dock this preview window. You may want to dock it down here and have a whole set of different preview windows up. So let's just say we had this noise pattern. We might make a preview for that, and we could dock that in here. I'll just pop it to the side, and then we'd have that there, so we can kind of see which ones we want. And if we want to get rid of these, we can just close them off really easily and that gives us some options to see previews for our materials as well as our maps. So now I'm able to really adjust a lot of these parameters. If I wanted to take this, and maybe that was a kind of orange fleck color that's in there instead of the white little flecks, then I could adjust that, and I already made this much bigger, so we'll go with 0.3 and render that out. And you can see we're starting to get what we might want out of that material. And for the most part, I've not had to use too much of the parameter editor here. So we can, close this out and just kind of use these additional parameters. You can also see I haven't had to use much over here of the material map browser. So I may just press O to get that. And that puts us in a much better situation where we're working with just the kind of schematic view here. And we don't have to work, I guess, as hard in order to, have, or we don't have to be as restricted in the space that we are. We can always pop back those windows when we need to. So I can go in and just kind of minimize this. Now, organizing these nodes and moving them around can, be a big problem, and that's something that you definitely want to learn how to do. There's a couple buttons up here that will kind of help us, and you can see my Move Children is toggled on. Yours may be on or off, and that helps us to move these nodes around as one piece. So if you have Move Children on, and I select this, anything that's after it will get moved with it, which is really pretty helpful. If that's off, then you'll just be moving each node individually. So you may want to toggle that on or off as you're working. And the other thing that you can do is as you start pulling these out, you may inevitably get all these nodes everywhere. You can kind of just auto lay out these nodes by pressing the hotkey L, and that will kind of lay them all out individually. So you can kind of move them there, and it'll kind of spread their hierarchies out as well. So I can kind of take these, and if this was a little bit smaller, I can press L, and you can see that that would center around there. Now that hotkey option is also present in the toolbar. We have Layout All, which will lay out the entire view, and Layout Children, which will just lay out the children of whatever it is that you have selected. So if we go over here and we have this node selected, we can just click on Layout Children, and it will just work for those. So if for instance we had these assorted the way that we wanted them to be, then we probably just use that Layout Children. And it's also moves up the hierarchy. So if we have these guys here, we just have that selected, we can say Layout Children to kind of move that into place. And if we have Move All Children, we can move that up there. That also has a hotkey, and those are also present in this menu. So we have Layout All and Layout Children. So I'll use C quite a bit, and actually L when needed, in order to lay out the views really quickly, because they become very cumbersome when you start adding in more and more, and I think that is really very helpful. Now there's only a couple other buttons we haven't looked at in this toolbar, and that is our Show Map in Viewport and Show Background in Preview, and we should be pretty familiar with both of those. Now one thing that we may not be used to is actually being able to see a lot of these maps in our preview the way that they would render. And that's something that 2011 brings to the table quite well. So if I just go and say Show Map in Viewport, what will happen is we can start to see the way that this map may look when it's rendered. And this particular one for the fall off map isn't one that will actually show up. There's a few of them that do, and a few of them that don't. One of them is definitely the noise. So if we go in and we say that we want to see that noise in the viewport. Previously, we weren't really able to see what the actual noise would look like. It would always map to a UVW space and not really show us the actual size. But if you can see here, when I render this out, and what we'll do is we'll just take this, and I'm going to take that noise directly and pipe it into the diffuse. And that way when we render it out, you'll see that noise is pretty much the exact same size and look as we have in the viewport, which is really pretty helpful. So you can adjust those and be able to see those in the viewport, and you can also see them hardware shaded. When we bring up our character and start piping materials into that, we'll really see where that makes a big difference. So I'm going to take this and just kind of disconnect it from there so that we get back what we wanted and bring our diffuse color back in, and then we can kind of see how that's going to look on our teapot. So the next thing I want to look at is just adding in some of these controllers. So I'm going to go into additional parameters. And you can see that we have a lot of values like the reflect amount and reflection color, luminosity, and things of that nature. And a lot of these we can adjust with an actual controller. So if I go in here and let's just go and choose our glossiness, and let's pipe that up to any, you can see that we can get all these different controllers. We can have a float list and linear and scripts and all the rest of that, but we'll just choose our noise because that'll give us a quick understanding of how that might work. And then when we go up, this is a good place to do the preview. So I'm just going to right click and say open preview, and I'm going to just dock that at the bottom. So now when I'm working with this controller here, you can see that I have my noise flow controller, which has the noise strength as a Bezier controller, and the default value is 5, and that's going to be piped in here, which is then going into my glossiness. If I play this back, you can see in the viewport what will happen, and if I just scrub this, you can see the update on the preview. So what this is doing is just adjusting that glossiness based on the noise controller. So this is something that you can easily do in the regular interface of Macs, but it's really nice to be able to see this particular setup and be able to look at how those controllers are laid out in the view. We also have access to things like these colors, so if we just want to go and grab like the luminosity color, we can bring out like a Bezier color controller, and we can control that color there. So we can start to put in any sort of values here that you wanted to adjust with a controller. So whether it's a regular Max controller, a script controller, or anything like that, you can kind of pipe these into these values, and then we can just kind of close that up and minimize these, and we'll just press C to organize that there. And I'm just going to pop this out of here so that we've kind of organized our view. So now we have this kind of noise controller controlling the glossiness. We have a color controller that is controlling the luminosity channel, and some of these other maps that are controlling are just diffuse and everything, which is pretty easy to see in our schematic view. So the next thing we're going to do is bring our character in here and see how those materials are set up on him. In this session, we're going to take a look at using Slate to texture our game character here. You want to open the file character rig start slate.max, and let's just press M to bring up our Slate Material Editor. Over here in the left, under the Material and Map browser, I'm just going to scroll down to the sample slots and choose the sample slot that's assigned to this character. So you can see it's this one, standard _7. Not really named the best. We'll say we want an instance of that. And to rename this, we can do one of two things. You can just double click on it and rename it over here. Or you can right click on the node and say rename, which I'm going to do. I'm going to name it char mat for character material. And I'm going to close both of those windows so that I have a little bit more room to work with. So this is the material that's applied to our character, and I'm just going to drag out a diffuse color. I can either go in my custom area or in maps and choose bitmap. And then I'm going to choose this bitmap from the DVD, EOS_D.TGA. This will be our diffuse map. Open that up. And we'll just double click on this guy. And you can even make it a little bit bigger if you want to, so you can see all the details of the head and everything else like that. Now to see this in the viewport, we can click on Show Map in Viewport, and we'll get something that looks a little bit like this. Might be how you're used to seeing textures displayed in the viewport without any hardware shading. And that's what we want to start to use, is some of the hardware shading. So what we'll do is select the material itself, and instead of using the show map in viewport, we're going to click on the flyout and choose show material in viewport with hardware map. So then what we should be able to see is our character. I'm just going to take that map away. So here's our character, and you can see the detail level that we have on this character. So we can really see how this would look either in a final render or definitely in game. We have all the details of the map there because it's being offloaded to the GPU, and we're getting to see that display here in the viewport itself. Now let's add in some more of these. The next thing I'm going to do is add in a bump map. Now in order to do that, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm not going to use these controllers a lot. So like we learned before, I'm going to right click. I'm going to go to Show Hide Slots, Maps, or Additional Parameters, and then Maps, and just say Hide All. And that way these guys won't pop up on me anymore. So now what I can do is drag out the bump. And we're not going to use a regular bump, we want to use a normal bump. So go to Maps and choose Normal Bump. And then in the normal slot, let's go to a bitmap. And we're going to choose our normal map, which is EOS_N. And that's going to give us our normal bump. Now you'll see that this, as we're adding maps and the shader gets calculated, this is kind of changing to that checker map as we go through. And that's something important to recognize, but that shouldn't block your workflow from 3ds Max. 3ds Max should kind of operate. You should be able to navigate in the viewport and hear as it's building the shader behind the scenes, which is pretty useful. So we can see that we have our bump map here, maybe not as clear as we might like, so I'm just going to actually disconnect really quick the diffuse color. And now we can really see the detail level that we have with our normal bump map. We have all these details on the character's face, on the horns, the body, the back of the character, and all that stuff is nicely hardware shaded in the viewport here. So we can bring that back up and pipe our diffuse color back in here. So the next map we're going to add in is going to be a self-illumination map, and for that I want to unhide a couple of objects that come with this character. So we'll just go in to the layers, and under the character, just unhide the other objects that are with this character. Its necklace, the lamp, the rope, etc. And we should be able to see those in the scene. So when you come around, we're going to have a self-illumination map that works on all these cryptic little letters and this little light that's inside the character's body cavity that lights it up on the inside, and some stuff that happens on the back here. So in order to do that, we'll go and grab our map. Just drag out the self-illumination bitmap and choose that self-illumination map, which is EOS_E. And we'll open that up. I just want to double click on it so that I can make it a little bit bigger and we can kind of see what we have here. So you can see that the light area, the body cavity, and some of these things around the text of the character are there. And I'm going to continually just kind of select the material itself and press C in order to readjust the way that these nodes look here in the view. And if I pan around, we should be able to see that those guys are glowing a little more. We have some in there. And over the back, we have a little bit more glow. But we actually kind of want a lot more than that. So let's double click on the material itself. And what we need to do is set the self-illumination to color. And what that'll do is really give us this nice glow that we can see in the viewport inside the body, around the eyes, and around all these letters here, which is exactly what we want. And we want to be able to see all this stuff in the viewport as we might see it closer to what we might see in the final render or in game. So we can kind of see those things happening here. Now what we'll do is go over and just adjust this slightly. So we have this nice glow in the view. What I want to do is add in something to maybe change the color of that. So I'm going to right click and go to Maps and choose Color Correct. And the Color Correct map, I'm going to drag right onto this wire to insert it. And then I'm just going to go to the material and I'll press C. I'll double click on this map. And then I can adjust things like the tint. So I'm going to go into tint, change it to something like blue, and then we'll change the strength to 100, and we can see that update in the viewport. So now we can have a blue tint, or and that'll come across all the way over there, or we can change it to any color we want. So we can get pretty much real-time feedback in the view as to how we want this to look. So I'll change it to, I kind of like the purple, or maybe this reddish orange look. We'll go with the reddish orange. And we can take that forward to something like this diffuse map. Let's just go in and rename these maps as well, just so that we're kind of keeping everything tidy. So we'll rename this diff color. And this guy is going to be glow CC for color correct. Normal bump is fine. We'll just rename this normal M for the normal map. And now at least we have those kind of tidied up there. So I can go in and right click and add something else to maybe adjust the diffuse color. So we'll add maybe an output map and just insert that there. Position that and just press C. And I can double click on this and adjust some of the things there. I can also go into just those output parameters and adjust things right here. So if I don't want to be all the way in there and keeping that view pretty heavy, then I can bring these down. And you can use some of your hotkeys too if you're holding down Control or Shift if you want to adjust these that way. So the RGB level, the offset if we want to adjust kind of the saturation or something like that. And if we need access to curves, we can go in and adjust some of those things. So we'll set the RGB level to 1. And with this output map, we can maybe enable the color correct. We'll go with RGB. And just adjust that red so we can bring the red down so that it's not quite as red and we have kind of this greenish character. Or we can beef it up so that there's a little more red hue to it. Whatever we want to kind of adjust for that, we can, which is pretty useful. And the last map we'll add is our specular level. So we'll just drag this out. We'll go to bitmap and add in our specular level. We'll let that, and we can see that we can move around the scene while we look at this. And I'll press C just to organize that a little bit better. M to get rid of it. And we can see that we have our character here with the specular level. We'll bring this back up and just double click so that we can adjust the glossiness as well. So if we want this to be more or less glossy, we can. And now we get all those specular highlights on the character. So for now we're getting a good representation of how this character would look in the final render or in-game. And to kind of further this, I want to talk a little bit about adding all these maps and being able to see them here or have them render out via GPU, and that's concerning the file size. Whenever you start creating all these nodes, whatever shaders you add, like this output shader or the bitmap, you're going to need to have enough memory on your video card in order to take care of that and load those shaders as well as textures onto the video card so that you can see them in the scene. And that's something that you want to be mindful of. If you go too far and you run out of RAM, Macs may get unstable or your textures may not show up or something like that. So in that case, it's really important to optimize where you can. One place that's really great to optimize is with these bitmap nodes. Of course, you can make the file size as small as possible, but you can also use a different sort of bitmap node. We have this node here, which you can see has a lot of different parameters under noise and the UV information and the time and output all right in there. There's actually a much simpler node that can be used in order to reduce the wear or reduce the usage on your video card. So in order to do that, we're going to switch over to Mental Ray. Let's just go in here under Common Parameters and Assign Renderer. we'll assign mental ray. And now when we right click, you'll see we have maps, and we'll have mental ray maps as well as meta SL maps. And the one that we're looking for is this texture lookup 2D. If I create that, you'll see that it's really a very simple map or material that you can use in order to replace this bitmap, which is a little bit more intense and will cause to have more instructions on the video card. So I'm just going to double click on this guy, copy, double click here, and paste. And then I'm just going to replace that. Now, you may get some issues here in the viewport. Another thing to remember is when you're trying to reduce this stuff for render, you want to cut out as many of these types of things as you can, the output map and other things like that. So we're just going to bypass this output map to go directly in, and then we'll go through and adjust all the rest of these maps. So you can either shift drag in order to create a copy of this, or you can just right click and create a new one if you want to. And we'll go and just add the rest of these. So I'm going to copy that and paste it in here. Then we'll pipe that result in. And while we're doing this, we may get some anomalies in the viewport. We'll kind of fix those up a little bit later. So again, I'll go in here, add that texture lookup, and this is all just to reduce the amount of memory that we need on our video card in order to supply all this stuff. So I'm pasting that in there. And this wants to go in, pipe it in here to the color correct because we want to keep that. And last but not least will be our bump map. Paste that in there. So if you know that you're going to be doing a lot with the GPU or the Quicksilver renderer or something like that, it may behoove you to use these texture lookup 2D nodes from the very start. And you can see that we have the exact same look here, and we'll get a little bit further with this than we would before. So I'll just press C, and I can also use this hide unused node slots on any of these guys here so that we can just hide these guys and just tidy up the scene a little bit, like so. So now we've reduced the memory footprint a bit, and what I want to do is start to work with the in-view lighting. We kind of have our in-view materials all set up and looking really pretty good. So let's go into the lighting scenario. Let's go into the layers and just turn on the lights layer so that we can see this little environment that we have here. And this has a few different lights that are casting pretty simple 3-point lighting setup. What I want to do is click on the smooth highlights and go to lighting and shadows. You can see I'm using the scene lights. I could also use default lights, and it would go through and kind of calculate those. We'll go back to our scene lights here. And we want to say enable hardware shading. Now by default, pretty much everything will be on, so we'll kind of see our ambient occlusion as well as shadows and other things like that. I want to kind of deconstruct each one of these pieces. So let's go in and just uncheck each one of them. So we don't need exposure control, shadows, or the ambient occlusion. So we'll start off with the ambient occlusion. And to see this a little bit more clearly, what I like to do is just turn these materials off. So let's just go into maps and turn off each one of these. Self-illumination, bump map, and scroll back up. Let's make the diffuse color white. And actually turn off that self-illumination, and let's turn the self-illumination all the way up to 100. And the last thing we're going to do is just set this to standard as opposed to hardware shaded, so that we can more easily see the ambient occlusion in the viewport. So now we'll go in, we're going to say ambient occlusion, and let's just do this for all the maps. We'll go to show materials just as a standard display, and we'll be able to see that ambient occlusion happen there. Now normally this will just overlay over your scene, but I wanted to make the material, self-illuminated and use a standard one just so that it's easy to see and tune, and sometimes that works out a little bit better. So when I go in here, we'll just configure this ambient occlusion. We'll go to lighting and shadows and say configure, and we can decide the sample radius as well as the quality. We'll set the quality to high, and let's just set that sample radius a little bit higher, maybe 60. And we should see this, really start to smooth out there. So it really depends on how you want to set that up and what you want to get in the viewport. We'll go back here. And I think I'll bring it down to something like 40. And once we're happy with that, we can turn our shaders back on. So we'll just go back into the material. We can set that to color. And just turn all these maps back on. Specular level, self-illume, our bump map. And we'll turn on our hardware with maps as well, so we can see those in the scene. And the next thing that we want to turn on is our shadows. So we'll say enable shadows, and then we can see the shadows both on the character as well as on the environment here. And you can see we can move through in real time. They're a little bit aliased, but we can also choose to soften these or get soft shadows. So let's hop in here under lighting and shadows, and we'll say configure, and there's an option to have soft shadows, so we can click on soft, and then we get some nice soft shadows here. So this is pretty nicely detailed. We have our bump maps and our shadows, some ambient occlusion happening here in the viewport, which works out pretty well. And it should give us a pretty good idea of how this is going to render in Mental Ray. So let's hop up into Mental Ray. I'm going to turn off Final Gather because that's not really something that we need at the moment. And we'll render this out. And you can see, for the most part, it looks just as good in the viewport as it does here. We have about a 5-second render time going on with this character. Now, if we want to output this using the Quicksilver renderer, all we have to do is switch over to that renderer. So I actually want to just keep up that last render. So I'm going to go to rendering and just choose render frame window. And let's duplicate that so that we can kind of take a look at it later. And switch over to Quicksilver. So we're just going to go into the render dialog under common. Same way we switch to Mental Ray. We're going to choose Quicksilver Hardware Renderer. And basically what that's going to do is pretty much output what you see in the viewport here to a file sequence. So bring this down and just do a quick render. So what will happen is this will go through and it's done. You can see it took about a second in order to compile the shaders and give us our render, and we can compare this with Mental Ray. So let's just bring that up and take a look at the difference. So this is our Quicksilver render, this is our Mental Ray render. You can see for the most part they look fairly close. So are you going to get completely production ready, crazy displacement and super detail renders out of Quicksilver? No, not necessarily. But are you going to get kind of good enough for the middle of production, really nice quality so you can kind of see on those dailies? I think you definitely be able to get that. The one thing that's the most noticeable here in difference, I think, is the anti-aliasing. We don't really have any anti-aliasing here in Quicksilver. So let's just improve that. We're going to go to the rendering tab, and you can see we have hardware-based sampling. So we're going to just choose 2 or 4. We'll choose 2 for right now and re-render that. And you can see that sampling got a little bit better in some areas, and you can even choose 4 times. Now, one thing to remember is this is going to increase the amount of texture size and everything on your video card, so if you don't have enough RAM for that, it's something to watch out for. You can also choose a little bit of software sampling. So a lot of times what I like to do is go and say, maybe we'll use the 2x hardware based and then 4x on software, which is going to give us the 8x sampling, and render that out. We're still at about a second, and if we go in to some of these areas and bring back up our mental ray render, you can see it's really pretty similar to what we had there with mental ray, and we're basically I would say 5 or even closer to 7 or 10 times as fast, which is really pretty good. So I'm going to close that out, and we can go ahead and render out an animation with this. So to do that, I'm just going to create a camera in this view. We'll hit Control-C to create a new camera, and then I'm going to select that camera, go to Animation, Constraints, choose Path Constraint, and just constrain it to this path that goes around my character. And now you should see that just kind of circle around. One thing I'm going to do is go into the top view here, and I can just position this target so that it's in the center and it goes around the character. And I'm also going to set my time range to be 0 and 100 so that it loops around. And I think that we'll just raise this camera a bit. So just bring this down so that we can see the character, and just turn on safe frame so we can see what we're getting in the safe frame. Okay, so this is a little wobbly, but I think it'll probably do for a quick camera turnaround. And we want to render this out so that maybe we can send it off for dailies or for something else like that. So we'll go in here and just say we want to render the active time segment. I'm going to save this out just to somewhere on the desktop and click on Render. So now what's happening is it's going through, it's rendering frame by frame, and you should see that you get some pretty fast progress out of this. You can really do some fast animation tests that are a little bit more than just those, gray or wireframe renders. You can get some nice lighting, some nice textures, and all those things out of it. And really the big thing to notice is the speed. We have about 33 seconds to render out this entire piece for 100 frames, so that's close to a third of a second a frame, and we get some pretty good quality out of that. Just bring up this video really quick, and we'll play that back. You see, that's pretty good. We got some nice shadows, we got some nice detail on the character. Compression could be a little bit better. But we'll go with that for right now. So for something really fast and quick, works really, really well. You can also add in some other details to this. So if I go over to the rendering tab, there are things like the ambient occlusion, which we looked at, indirect illumination, which does this kind of point light indirect illumination, which is pretty cool, and maybe depth of field. Now all of these things are going to accumulate with the RAM and the CPU power or GPU power that's on your video card. So you do have to remember that if you start adding a lot of these in, it will make it the render take a bit longer. And on top of that, once you start to reach your GPU power or your RAM limit, things will become unstable in max and even slower. So one thing that's kind of cool to take a look at is the depth of field. We'll choose that, and you can either choose from camera or to override the camera. And this is a nice fast kind of screen space depth of field effect. I'll go back here, and we won't save this out. I just want to kind of quickly take one fast render of where we are here. And you can see we get this nice blur where the character is really close to the camera and it's focused right back here, which is kind of interesting. And we can take this and render it out as well. So we'll go in here and say our range And we'll just render this out again. We'll save over what we already had. And even with the depth of field, this doesn't really render that much slower. So you got some nice depth of field effects as well as your shadows and all of those things happening here, which work pretty well. Alright, so there, without me talking over it, we actually even reduced the frame time to 30 seconds for the entire thing with depth of field. We'll just pop up this video, and you can see we got some nice depth of field happening in there really pretty quickly. So that's how we can apply some materials to our character using Slate, get the hardware enabled materials in the viewport, and be able to see exactly what our character is going to look like a lot closer to what we might be used to at render time. Tune our lights for our scene in order to light with scene lights and see shadows and things like ambient occlusion in the viewport, and then render those out using the Quicksilver render for a really fast preview. And that's about it on the section for Quicksilver and Slate. And that should hopefully make your preview and in-view experience a lot better in 3ds Max. In this session, we're going to take a look at creating surface maps for this character here. If you just take a look at this character, you can see that this has been sculpted with a good amount of detail in the polys, and if we look in a wireframe view, you can see that there's a good amount of polygons here to represent the topology of the character, and that's something that you're going to want for creating surface maps. To create surface maps for this character, we're going to go to the rendering menu and choose Render Surface Map, and that'll bring up this little dialog here. Let's just take a quick render of the character first. So we can kind of see a lot of the details and everything that's going on with this character. There's a little background added in here, but there are no lights in this scene at all. What rendering out surface maps is going to allow us to do is create a bunch of different textures that we can then map onto this character to approximate things like ambient occlusion, a cavity map, subsurface scattering, and things like that. Now these won't be real lighting effects, they're just going to be texture based, so we're going to have to kind of layer them to get that type of effect. But they're very fast to render, and they can produce good results in some cases. So the first thing that you see here is we have the bitmap size. I'm just going to increase this to 2K so that we can have pretty large bitmaps to be working with. Now, I mentioned that it's important to have fairly dense and or good topology, meaning quads, to get this type of map out of the render surface map, because what it's going to do is it's actually going to look at the mesh and decide by edge angles or distances between polygons or the topology or normals in some way how to create these different maps. So the first we're going to do is just go down and say create a cavity map. So we'll click on that. And pretty quickly you'll see that we have this cavity map. And what this does is it basically looks in all the little creases. It makes darker pixels for where those creases might be and lighter pixels for the pieces that kind of stick out some. We also have the option to increase the contrast on this, so we maybe go up to a contrast level of 3 and render this out again. And you can see we get kind of a different result here. So that's given us a lot more contrast on our map. I think just the base level of 1 is going to be fine. So we can save this out, and we'll save this as cavity.jpg. The next map we'll create is a dust map. And basically this map is going to, we click on it, create a black and white image that is going to show the highs and lows of the mesh, meaning actually where the top and the bottom of things happen to be. So basically how dust might settle on an object. If the dust has a clear angle to reach like the top of the brow or underneath these eyes, then we're going to get a white area or on top of the lips. But underneath things, traveling down on Z, we're going to get a black area. So if you want to create kind of some, it's similar to a dirt map, but a dust map, then you can get something like this. And we'll just save this out as dust map. You can see also in this area of 3 different maps with density, dust, and subsurface that you have this blur option, and that'll blur the pixels as it gets created. You can also choose to blur the map once we import it in or in Photoshop or do touch-ups there. All those things are just fine. So the next one we're going to create is a subsurface map, and this is a map that is going to approximate what you might get with subsurface scattering. So basically it looks at the distance between any of these little folds in the character's face, and it's going to give you a white area like around this nose, and a darker area where it's going to be thicker. The distance between this polygon and the one on the other side is going to be very thick, so we'll get a dark area. This one, as well as the occlusion map, tend to take a bit to render, maybe a minute or two. So you can either drop the size down to 1K or just wait a couple minutes for it to render. It will give you a progress dialog box that will allow you to kind of gauge how long it's taking. Okay, so that took about a minute or so, and you can see that we get a nice, pretty smooth map of where we would have thin areas and where we would have thick areas on the meshes structure. So we can save this out as 3s.jpg. And we'll open that up later. And lastly, we'll just create an occlusion map. So this is similar to an ambient occlusion map, but of course there's no lights. So basically it's again going to look at the topology of the mesh and decide where there are places that it would be unlikely for the light to hit, like inside wrinkles and other things like that. And it's going to make those areas dark, and then it's going to make other areas that stick out white. And this is similar to the cavity map, but it does a little bit more intense calculation, and it probably takes about the same time as the subsurface map to calculate. So we'll just click on this one, and we'll wait for that to build out. Okay, so that's rendered out, and you can see we have a nice, pretty smooth AO map, pretty standard type stuff. So let's save this out. And we can use these maps to light and texture our character next. So let's just close these guys. And we'll take a quick render of our character, see how that's set up. And let's just go into the Material Editor. So we're going to open up the Slate Material Editor. And here I just have a default material. And we'll drag this over to our character to just assign that. So just move this over here and drag that onto our character. Next, we'll double click on this map, and I'm just going to name it Skull Head. And we'll double click on the icon so that we can see that a little bit better. And if I want to, I also might make a preview of this, so I can just right click and say Open Preview Window. And I can, dock or kind of pop this wherever I want. Maybe I'll put it over here just so that we can kind of see what's going on. Alright, so the first thing we'll do is we'll add our AO. So let's go into the diffuse color. And we'll drag that out. And we want to choose maps. And we're going to choose a mix map. We could put, the black and white map directly in, but that wouldn't give us any ability to modulate the color. So let's choose mix. And we'll get our mix map there. And right now I don't really want to see these controllers. So again, I'm just going to right click, go into the show hide slots, additional maps, and say hide all. That way we don't have to see any of the additional maps, at least for right now. So this is going to be our AO blend. And under the mix amount, now we'll choose that map. So I can choose this and just go bitmap. And we'll choose our AO map. And you can see that that's going to get added in there. So if we double click on the AO blend, we can change this to whatever we want. But if we render our character, now you can see that we get, those highs that are white and lows that are dark. And, maybe we can make these a little bit blue if we wanted the character to kind of have a kind of gray type of look or something like that. I think I'll adjust that to be a little less blue. And we can already see the additional, detail that we can get out of the AO like this. So I'm just going to go in and add our cavity map next. Now for that, if I double click on this material, we're going to want to add the cavity map in the diffuse level, and of course a blend shader doesn't have that. So let's choose a different shader. We could choose multi-layer, ordinary blend, or anisotropic. Those would all have a diffuse level to control. Ordinary blend tends to be pretty good for skin, so I think we'll choose that one, and then we'll have our diffuse level, which we can drag out. And this is where we want to add in our cavity map. Because the cavity map is just, modulating the value, we'll go straight and use the bitmap. And we'll add in our cavity map. This should make the look of it overall darker, but it'll give us a lot more of those little details in places. And oftentimes when you do add a cavity map, you'll want to go in and maybe increase the diffuse color, whatever that may be. So maybe we'll make this AO map a little more gray and white, so that we can bring in some of those highlights again. So now you can see we even have kind of another level of detail adding to our character. And some of these maps, including the cavity map, we may want to adjust. So if I just double click on the bitmap with a little bit of blur, if we go into blur offset, we can set that to 0.1. And some of those artifacts that we're seeing in places will get diminished a little bit. And you can, of course, paint some of those out or do a little bit more detailed texture work in Photoshop, which is probably a good idea with a lot of these maps. So the next thing that we're going to do is just set up a approximation of subsurface scattering. This is, of course, a fake because we don't have any lights in the scene, as is everything with these surface maps. So I'm going to just drag out the self-illumination channel, and I'm going to go into maps. So we could choose our just black and white map, but kind of in a similar respect, we want to choose maybe a mix map for this, because then we can modulate the colors. So I'm going to choose this mix map, and then in color 1, I'm going to have this be red. So we'll have this kind of be a bright red, and in color 2, we'll also have a bright red, and actually, color 1 maybe we'll make a dark blue, something like this. And we'll modulate that with our bitmap that we made. So we'll go and grab that subsurface scattering map. And here you can kind of see the map and how that gets set up. Now, under our shader, if we take a look at our preview over here, you can see that it's really, this value is just modulating the color. So if we do, or the value, so if we do this, you can see that some of that highlight is coming out just with the black and white values, but what we want to do is turn on color, and that's going to incorporate those colors that we have. So now we have, where we have these high pieces or thin pieces, it's going to be red, and it's going to be darker with the blue where it's a little bit lower. So if we go in, this is obviously very intense. We want to just bring down that self-illumination to maybe 20%. And then we'll start to get some of that red in some of the areas that are thinner, and you might see blood underneath, and it's going to be darker blue in other areas. So this is a really good and versatile way to get some quick subsurface scattering and kind of fake it in the renderer and get some nice results out of that. I'm just going to go in and add a bump map to this, and I'll use a real simple cellular map. I'm pressing L just to lay these out, and in that cellular map, call this skin bump. I'll just set it to chips, and I'll set the size to something like 8. I'll turn on fractal, set the iterations to 2, and we'll render that out just so that we can start to get a little bit more detail. This is, of course, much too strong, so we'll double click on the shader itself and bring the bump down to maybe 10 or 12. That way we can just get some of those bump details in here on the character. Okay, so now I want to go back and use the one more map we made, which is our dust map, so that we can add some like dirt or dust on some of these places where that would happen. So I'll just go back over here, and we're going to want to do that in the diffuse map. So what we're going to want to do is add another mix map. I'll just right click here, and I'll go and grab a mix map. And then I can actually pipe this right onto the wire, and it'll ask me which color I want to insert this into. I'll say color 1. I'll press L to lay that out. Now we have our AO map going into one channel of this mix map. So I'm going to call this dust mix. And we're just going to modulate this mix map with our dust map. So we'll go and grab that dust map. And what we should be able to see is, if we render this out, some white areas kind of coming up here. Just to make this a little clearer, let's take this second color and make it something outrageous like purple. And you can see that all those areas that would be white are getting this purple. So we can go in and add kind of an interesting color, maybe something like a greenish setup in there, so that we can start tinting some of these areas and build up some detail. And we can even go in and add something like a noise map. And inside our noise map, just adjust that size. So we'll drop this down to something like 5, and we'll set it to fractal and re-render, and you can see that we have a nice pattern there. Maybe even make it a little bit smaller, and then we can change our colors. So we can go back here and copy that color, and we'll paste it in, and just make one lighter than the other. So now we have some nice detail of that kind of noise pattern coming up in different areas, and you can see under here in the shoulders too. I want to just go in here and add one more detail to our subsurface scattering map. So call this 3S blend, and add just another layer to give us like a rim light around the back here. So to do that, what I'm going to do is add another fall off map. And I'm going to insert it right here in between our 3S map and the base. And you can see right off the bat that this gives us, a highlight all the way around the character. We'd like that to be a little bit thinner. So I'm just going to call this backlight or highlight, and we'll call it rim light. And instead of white, I'll choose like an interesting kind of blue rim light. And I'll change this from perpendicular to parallel to Fresnel. And that'll give us a pretty tight, light rim light around the edges. And this just gives us some kind of interesting effects around the rim of the character. And in some cases, I might want to make this brighter, but I don't want to brighten the overall subsurface scattering effect. Actually, I think right now I'd probably want to bring that subsurface scattering down even a bit more to maybe 15, because this is good to kind of demo the way it looks, but maybe not as realistic as I might like. And then up just the rim light. And in order to do that, what I'm going to do is just go into my rim area, and I want to add a map here because just this color is what I want to increase the output on. So to do that with just a color, I'm going to use the color correct, because basically this will give you just a color or a map that then you can add gamma values and other things to. So right now, by just adding the color correct and adding this map here, what I've done is I pretty much have the same thing as just having a color in that slot. And I can simply go into Advanced, and under Gain, I can increase the gain of this. So this is just increasing the gain of that one color, and you can see that kind of coming up, whereas the rest of it is not. So you can see here, this is a little bit intense, but good for demonstration purposes, I guess. I will probably go in and bring that back down. So let's just go into that color correct, and maybe make it something like 300. And this just gives us an interesting little fake rim light that's going around the character that might add a little interest to the scene. So this is the basics of how you might set up some of those surface maps and layer them together to get some different effects with the cavity map, the dust maps, and your AO stuff. You could definitely take this further. We're still using just basic colors for the AO. You could use 2 different texture maps that you've painted up in Photoshop or 3ds Max And you can go in and do a lot more with any one of these and just kind of continue to layer them using your black and white maps to blend or modulate whatever it is that you're creating. And, just try and get as much mileage as you can from a simple setup. This doesn't have any lights in the scene, and if we were to add in, some lights, we'd even get a lot better results too. So hopefully that helps you out with setting up some surface maps in 3ds Max 2011. In this section, we're going to take a look at using the new Viewport Canvas tools to paint on meshes in 3ds Max. 2011 introduced a brand new painting tool where you can just paint directly on a model, and it's actually really pretty comprehensive. So let's try that out. You can see that we have this mesh here, and if we go into edge faces, that it's pretty low poly. And we're going to use this to paint on. We also have our normal map, so if you pop into the Material Editor, you'll see that the only map that this has is a normal bump map. I'm using a Wacom tablet for this section because whenever you're trying to paint any textures, it's probably a good idea. And one of the new features of Viewport Canvas is it has been Wacom enabled. So to paint on this mesh, we're just going to select it, and then we're going to go to Tools and choose Viewport Canvas. This is going to open up this dialog of tools, and you can see there's a bunch of hopefully fairly familiar tools like a paintbrush, clone, paint bucket, and things like that. We also have things for adjusting our brushes and viewing the 2D view and things of that nature. So the first thing I'm going to do is dock this over to the left so that it's a little bit easier to navigate in my interface. And then if I want to paint on anything, all you have to do is select it and then choose this paint button. What will happen is it will ask you basically what channel you want to paint on. And for us, we're going to choose the diffuse color. We're presented with a dialog that basically wants to know what size we want to make our first color and where we want to save the file to. So I'm going to say that we want it to be 2K. And this is just because actually I have some of those other maps like an AO map and other diffuse maps that I might want to blend in with what I'm painting. And I know that their resolution is 2K. You could set it to whatever you want. And we're going to tell it to save into this folder. You'll see that we have a couple other maps here that we may be making use of later, and our normal map is in here. We're just going to call this color.png. And it'll ask us what kind of ping we want to save out. And that's basically it. We can click on OK, and this is going to save out that map. And depending on what your preferences are, it'll bring up this little layers palette. You can get this layers dialog by just clicking this button and hide it as well. That's really one of the major improvements here in this latest tool is you have a full range of layers, blend modes, opacities, masks, and all sorts of other things that you can work with here, which is really pretty good. I definitely recommend that we take advantage of using these layers. So to get started, we can just paint right on this mesh. If you do paint, you're going to be painting on the background layer, which is something you might want to be aware of. So I'm just going to kind of zoom in here, and I'm going to start drawing. You can see because I have my Wacom tablet, I'm getting pressure sensitivity on all of these strokes, so they're smaller, and I can really get some pretty fine details. And the more I zoom in, the better the detail level of these paintings or of this will be. So I can just kind of sketch those really pretty easily. If I scroll down here into the tablet pressure, you can see that right now the brush radius and opacity is being controlled. And that's usually a good default. You can also control the scatter or hardness and uncheck these as you go. Now normally if I was working like this, I would probably scroll back up and let me just fill in some of this color. So we'll fill it with gray again. I'll bring up this little palette. You can have a little color palette here, and you can also load and save these out, which is pretty useful if you have some that you're using. And I'm just going to fill this a few times. so that we get back to a basic gray. And we can kind of see how that adds there. If I am going to work just you know, on that background layer, that's kind of one thing, but I really recommend adding different layers in. So let's click on Add New Layer, and you can see that we get this layer here, and we can choose whatever color that we want to start painting with. So let's explore some of the brushes and how this stuff works. So right now I'm actually able to see this little brush highlight, which is pretty helpful depending on what you happen to be doing, and you can make, you know, some pretty nice strokes with it. And the option for seeing this highlight is under brush settings in brush preview. You can see that if maybe you were zooming in and you really wanted to get those small strokes, then you may not want to have that brush preview on. Now, it is very useful if you're using any sort of brush images. You can see right now we're not, but we can use any sort of brush images. So there's a couple color presets and mask presets that come with it, and there's also custom maps. If we just go into Browse Custom Maps directory, you can see that I've added in, just by copying these files, a couple of skin files for skin color. And these are on the disk, so you can copy them into your Viewport Canvas Custom Brushes folder. And when you do that, and you click on Reload Custom Maps, you'll see them all show up there. So there's a few different textures here. If you don't want to do that, you can still use these basic color brushes, and we'll just make the brush size a little bit bigger. So we'll increase the radius over here, and you can see that we have kind of the display of this texture. So as I drag, I'm getting this texture painted on the character. So we'll just go through and kind of paint through. And we have all sorts of things like opacity. So we can adjust the opacity of this brush as well as, you know, the pressure of that opacity. So this is kind of the max opacity that it will reach if we want to. And hardness as well as spacing. Let's just start to use a mask so we can look at some of the spacing. And I'll grab this abstract one in the middle. So now if we go over and let's just pick a different color. We'll pick a little bit of a darker color so we can kind of see that, and increase the opacity so that we can really see it on the mesh here. Okay, so now you can kind of see what's going to get drawn and how it gets drawn on the character, and where spacing might come into play. So any of these kind of stamp type masks, you may want to adjust the spacing so that you can kind of spread it out. And I think something like maybe 0.8 or 1 will be good for this one. And we can just kind of click and drag and get these details on the character. So that's a few basics on how to kind of load these up. As we build up more layers, so I might just undo that a few times. I'm hitting Control Z and add in a new layer. And this type of detail, I might go in and just kind of paint on the character. And you can see that even though it's a low poly character, we're getting, you know, this is actually a paint or 2D projection onto the surface. So we're getting really pretty high detail on this, which is really great. So I'm just going in and painting this, and you know, the versatility, of course, of working with layers is then I can go in and I can drop or bring up the opacity. I can choose different things like color burn, screen, or anything like that. So screen's, you know, a good option just to kind of break up that texture that was underneath. And we have something like that. Now, as I'm kind of painting here, you see that we're painting on one side of the character's face. We also have the ability to go down into brush behavior and choose a mirror axis. So I'm just going to choose X, and now everything that I get painted on one side will paint on the other. So I can go back and kind of mess around with some of that stuff. So I'll just delete these two layers. We'll ask it not to use our mask, and we'll get that basic skin. I'm going to choose one of these skins that I have here and just kind of start painting just to rough out some color on both sides of this character. So I'm using you know, a real simple skin texture that isn't really tileable, but because we have these fall offs and everything else, we're able to easily adjust where it goes on the character. I'll just zoom in a bit so that we can paint on here. And on the top of the head of the character. So this is a little blotchy up here. Depending on if we wanted to use a larger texture or more tileable one or something like that, we can definitely do that. And we can also use some of these tools up here. So we have a blur as well as a smudge tool, and we can kind of blur those things out. And we can also do that on a kind of global basis. So I just want to take a quick look at a couple of the filters. We'll go over into this layer, which is actually the background layer, and just choose blur. And we can adjust how much we're going to blur this. So we'll blur it a little bit. And say OK. Then we'll just go in and I'm going to paint over here. And to make your brush size larger, you can hold down Control Shift and then just click and drag, and that's going to increase your brush size. So if we wanted something that was much larger on this character, we could just lay down some pretty large brush prints. And that way on the top of the head we won't get too much of that issue that we were seeing before. So I'm going to increase or add another layer to this. And I'll decrease that brush size, again holding down Control and Shift. And let's just hop back out to see how this looks with our normal map in rendering. So when we're done painting on this particular layer, we can just click on the brush again. And it's going to ask us where we want to save the texture. Now we have two layers here, and whatever we do on them, if we want it not to be flattened, we're going to have to save as a PSD. If we just flatten the layers and save it as a texture, it's just going to flatten everything down. The option I like to use in this case is save as PSD and replace texture and material. So basically it's going to make that PSD material, and it's also going to put it in and just save this out. So diff color.psd, and we'll pop out, we get our diffuse color, and we can kind of see how that works with our normal map on the character. I'm going to hop back in and do some more painting. And because we saved it out as a PSD, all of our layers and everything is all set up there, which is really pretty useful. Now, if I have some textures that I've made elsewhere or in Photoshop or wherever, then I can go and choose File, Load Bitmap into Current Layer. And that's what I'm going to do because I already have this AO file for the skull. So I'm going to choose this AO file. And I may want to blend that in with my diffuse color. So, I can take this and I can choose Multiply. And that's going to add a lot of that texture in for the character, which is really pretty useful. And I can also use it as just a reference for, this is a pretty low poly mesh, and just as a reference for where I want to add details to the character in the diffuse color. So I'm going to add another layer here. And while I have these multiple layers, I'm just going to double click and rename this one AO. And then I'll go up here. So I want to add in some details around this character's eyes and teeth and things like that. So I'm keeping the symmetry on. And I'm going to go in here and rough out some details on this layer. I'll just bring my brush size down a little bit. And let's grab one of these, this kind of ugly skin texture in here. And I'm going to start kind of painting with that right in there. And this one is actually, it has a pretty large, if we just make the brush bigger, it has a pretty large like up and down type of texture that's going on. You can see it repeating there, which is okay. I'm just going to hit Control Z and make my brush size a little smaller. Again, Control Shift to do that. If I wanted to follow along, I'm going to choose Follow Stroke. And then what will happen is as I'm stroking, that line will kind of follow along there, which is really pretty useful. So I'm still using that pressure sensitivity, and as I get bigger, this gets bigger there, which is pretty cool. And I'm just going to go in, make this a little larger, and add some detail in here. Okay, so I'm going to choose a different texture, maybe just one that's a little bit darker. And we'll use the mask as well. And just kind of go in between there and start roughing in some of that. I'm going to bring the spacing down a bit. And just painting some interesting details for this diffuse texture on the character. And while I'd like to use that mask, I'm going to ask it not to use the color and get something that's a little darker and kind of grimy and green to add in as well. Make my brush a little bit smaller and just going to zoom in a bit. There we go. And I can hide or unhide any of these layers to kind of see how they're interacting and play around with maybe making this screen or soft light to kind of blend it in with the texture. And then I'm going to go in to around the teeth here and just kind of do some of the same similar stuff here. I think maybe I'll make it a new layer. And I know that right around here I want it to be real kind of green and grimy. I'll zoom out a little bit. Now if I'm dealing with just like a regular color here, I can also choose to use some randomization. So when I go down here, you can see there's all sorts of randomization that you can use for just the brush radius and opacity. This is in addition to whatever you might have for your Wacom tablet. I'm going to choose color and just kind of randomize it to a different color. And that way, when I kind of paint, you can already see how the color changes. It adds a little bit of noise to what's kind of going on there. So I'm going to add that in. Just start to paint with some of this grime in here. Nothing like some grimy gums. And I'll change that color a bit. And maybe I'll experiment with using a different mask. So let's turn off this color. And I'm just going to get this mask here, which will give me kind of some speckled results. Decrease that spacing, that we get a bit more of this. And I'm going to turn off the mask and just go in with a color that would be kind of good for the teeth. We'll bring the overall opacity down a bit. Just kind of lay that stuff in there. Now I'm zooming in quite a lot on the screen here, which is great. But if you want to actually see what's going on in the texture view, you can click on this 2D texture, and you can bring this up and you can paint right in the 2D texture view as well. So let me just bring this up here. I'm going to say 1:1. Maybe make this a little bit larger. And I can zoom and pan in here. And just start to mess around in this view. I can ask it to show the grid or not. And this will show all the layers that are present that I've painted on here. So if I want to have any of these up here and work on a layer, I can do that, and I can just paint right in this view here. which is definitely pretty useful, especially if you want to do large things and something that would be across the entire character. For now, I'll just kind of play around in this view. And we'll zoom back out a bit. I'm going to set that to screen and maybe bring the opacity down a little bit, added a little bit of detail in there for that character's face. And we're going to hop back out. So let's just click there. And you can see that we can hop back out and play around here. So the next thing that I'm going to do is actually bring in another diffuse texture. So I'll hop back in here. We have all of our layers, and I'm going to make a new layer. Go to File, Load Bitmap into Current layer. And there's actually a painted diffuse layer here, so it's skull diffuse.tga. I'm going to open that in, and you can kind of see how this looks. So we can set this to anything that we want, or we can, so we can set it to screen so that we pick up some of the detail underneath, or we can put it anywhere in the stack that we want to, or even adjust our opacity up and down from it. I think it has some pretty good details, so I'm going to kind of choose to use this overlay here. And we can also set where we might want to see some of these details and where we might not want to. So let's just go to Layer and say Add Layer Mask, and we're going to say that we would like to hide all. And then as we're painting on that layer mask, we'll just paint with a white. It's going to reveal whatever's underneath. So we can go in and kind of paint that wherever we want to see any of these textures. So you can kind of layer these in. And as we do this, you can go into Filter, and you can choose a couple of different filters that you probably, pretty familiar with. High Pass, Blur, Sharpen. So we could say Blur. And basically we're blurring that mask there so that it blends a little bit more evenly with our character. I don't think I want to work with this mask right now, so I'm just going to go to either Disable or Delete Layer Mask. We'll say Disable for now. And I think, just setting it to Overlay will work for us. And let's go and paint on a different channel. So to do that, we're going to hop out. This is going to save everything. Now we have our normal map, our diffuse map, everything is in there for the character. And we're going to scroll down to Options, and you can see right now we're painting on the diffuse color. If we want to paint on a new color, basically once we've started painting, remember when we first started painting, we got the option of what to paint on. And once we've done that, it's going to just bring us back and forth as we've done a couple times. What you want to do is go into Options, and this will give you your options again. So if we want to go into something like the normal bump and paint in the additional bumps, we can do that. So for this, I'll just make it 1024, or actually we'll make it 2K so it matches, and we'll save this up as Add Bump. We're going to save out the PSD afterwards, so it's probably not going to matter so much what we save it out. This is just for giving it a directory to work with. Then we'll say OK. And it's going to bring us to here where we can see, our diffuse as well as our bump map, because we'll be painting on that additional bump map now. So now we can go in and just use black and white. So I'll set this to white, and we'll use this mask here. And we can start painting on this character. So actually, why don't we go ahead and we'll fill with black. Or I guess it'd be better to fill with white. We can go into the 2D view and just fill it a few times so that it's a little whiter. And then we'll paint with black. So this is just adding in a little bit more bump detail of whatever it is that you want. We can choose different masks here. So I'm going to choose this mask right here, and we'll increase the spacing. Give us some interesting detail on the character. Bring that in there. We can blend that together. And this will just be added to the additional bump channel. Go in and add some of these guys. Just make that brush a little bit bigger. Blending in some detail there. And then we'll hop out. And this is going to get added there. So now you can see that in our additional bump channel, we have all that detail that we painted in. We want to just kind of bring that detail level down so that it's not quite as bumpy. So we can just go into the material and adjust that. So we'll hop in. Go in a bump, and you can see an additional bump. We have that there. So maybe we'll bring that down half as much and see if that'll work out well for us. So it's much more tame, and we've been able to add in some more details to the normal map that we painted on. So that's pretty much how to use the new Viewport Canvas tools in 3ds Max 2011. I find them hugely useful. It's a great leap forward in texturing and painting right in the viewport in Max. And there's a lot of great options in here to explore and use. I think it's a super tool for texturing characters as well as objects in your scene. Thank you very much.